Welcome to Mythwalker Archives, a place where the ancient and the subconscious meet in the quiet hours, where stories older than empires drift through the mind like shadows cast by firelight, and where sleep becomes a gentle journey into the depths of human memory. Tonight, we turn our attention to one of the most psychologically complex civilizations ever to emerge from the sands of time, a culture that did not simply fear death, but transformed that fear into an entire cosmos of meaning, ritual, and profound symbolic architecture. Tonight, we explore ancient Egyptian myths, not as distant curiosities or historical footnotes, but as living psychological patterns that still move through the human mind in the darkness, shaping how we dream, how we judge ourselves, and how we confront the ultimate unknown that awaits every conscious being. There is a question that haunts humanity across every culture, every century, every individual life, a question that surfaces in the quiet moments before sleep, in the examination of conscience that occurs when the day's distractions finally fade. What happens when we are measured? The ancient Egyptians did not avoid this question. They built an entire afterlife around it, transforming the universal anxiety of judgment into a mythology so detailed, so psychologically penetrating, that it reveals something essential about the human relationship with guilt, worthiness, and the terror of being truly known. The myth of judgment after death stands at the center of Egyptian cosmology, not as a simple moral tale, but as a sophisticated expression of inner anxiety, a projection of the conscience onto the architecture of eternity itself. In the Hall of Mad, the place where souls arrived after the journey through death, there stood a scale of impossible precision, a scale that weighed not gold or grain, but something far more intimate, the human heart. The deceased would enter this hall, their identity stripped of all earthly power, all social status, all the masks worn during life, and they would stand before 42 divine judges, each representing a specific sin, a specific failure, a specific way that a human being could have violated the cosmic order known as mad. The heart, called the Ib in ancient Egyptian, was placed upon one side of the scale, and on the other side rested a single feather, the feather of Mad herself, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic balance. If the heart was heavier than the feather, if it carried the weight of lies, cruelty, theft, violence, or any disruption of the sacred order, it would sink. And in that moment of imbalance, a creature waited in the shadows of the hall. Ammit, the devourer, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, a composite beast that represented the ultimate terror of annihilation. Ammit did not merely kill, she erased, consuming the heart and with it the very essence of the individual, leaving nothing behind, no afterlife, no memory, no continuation of consciousness, only absolute and eternal nothingness. This is not a simple story of punishment. It is a profound psychological map of how human beings experience guilt, shame, and the fear of being fundamentally unworthy. The Egyptians understood something that modern psychology would rediscover thousands of years later, that the human mind contains within itself a witness, an observer, a part of the self that watches, remembers, and judges every action, every thought, every deviation from the internal moral code. The heart in Egyptian mythology was not just a physical organ. It was the archive of lived experience, the container of memory and intention, the part of the self that could not lie even when the mouth spoke falsehoods. This myth emerges from a deep subconscious understanding that we carry within ourselves the evidence of our own lives, that there is no escape from self-knowledge, no way to flee from the accumulated weight of our choices. The Hall of Mad is not truly a place. It is a psychological state, the moment of radical honesty that occurs when all external validation falls away, and the self must confront itself without distortion or defense. Why did the Egyptians fear this judgment so profoundly that they developed elaborate rituals, spells, and protective formulas to survive it? Because judgment after death represents the ultimate loss of control, the moment when the carefully constructed identity dissolves and what remains is only the truth of what one has been, what one has done, how one has moved through the world. The fear is not of gods but of oneself, of the possibility that when all is measured, when all is weighed, the self will be found lacking, will be discovered to be less than it believed, will fail the test of its own deepest values. This anxiety appears across cultures in different forms. The Christian final judgment, the Buddhist karmic accounting, the Islamic weighing of deeds, the Greek journey across the river Styx with Karen Dem. Ending payment. Every tradition that contemplates an afterlife eventually confronts this same psychological necessity. The need to believe that life has moral meaning, that actions have consequences, that the universe itself cares about how we have lived. The Egyptian version is remarkable for its specificity, for the way it transforms abstract moral anxiety into concrete imagery, giving shape to the shapeless dread that accompanies mortality. Modern psychology recognizes this pattern in the formation of the superego, the internalized voice of judgment that Freud identified as the part of the psyche that enforces moral standards, that generates guilt when those standards are violated, that creates the sensation of being watched even when alone. The gods in the Hall of Mad are not external beings, but projections of this internal process, the personification of conscience itself. When we dream of being tested, of standing before authorities who examine us, of being found inadequate or exposed, we are experiencing the same archetypal pattern that the Egyptians encoded in their mythology of judgment. The heart being weighed is not an ancient superstition. It is a perfect metaphor for the way human consciousness experiences moral self-evaluation, the way we feel the burden of our choices, the way guilt accumulates like weight, pressing down on the center of our being. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, consider this, that the Hall of Mad exists not in some distant afterlife, but in the quiet moments of reflection, in the times when you measure yourself against your own values, when you wonder whether you have lived with integrity, whether you have caused harm, whether you would be found worthy if everything were known. The Egyptians understood that this judgment is not something that happens once, at the end of life, but something that happens continuously, in the privacy of consciousness, in the relationship between the self that acts and the self that observes. The fear of judgment after death is ultimately the fear of self-knowledge, the terror of discovering that we are not who we believed ourselves to be. And in recognizing this ancient pattern, in seeing it clearly for what it reveals about the human mind, we begin to understand why mythology endures, why these stories still speak to something fundamental in the architecture of awareness itself. The heart, in Egyptian understanding, was not merely a muscle that pumped blood through the body, not simply the biological engine of physical life, but something far more intimate and far more dangerous. The repository of truth itself, the organ that remembered everything, that recorded every intention, every hidden motive, every secret deviation from the path of man, and this heart could not be silenced, could not be controlled, could not be made to lie even when survival depended upon deception. The ancient fear of the heart being weighed reveals a psychological terror that transcends culture and time, the fear that our inner reality might betray us, that the part of ourselves we cannot fully govern might speak against us when judgment arrives, that we are not truly the authors of our own defense, but are instead at the mercy of our own accumulated experience. This is why the Egyptians developed spells specifically designed to prevent the heart from testifying against its owner, magical formulas inscribed on scarabs and amulets, pressed against the chest of the mummified body, whispering instructions to the heart. Do not stand as witness against me. Do not speak of what you know. Do not reveal the weight of what I carry. These spells, found throughout the Book of the Dead, are not crude attempts at deception, but profound expressions of the split within human consciousness, the recognition that we contain within ourselves both the actor and the witness, both the one who lives and the one who judges that living, and that these two aspects of self are not always in alignment. The heart as witness appears in other mythological traditions, each culture finding its own language for this same psychological reality. In Mesopotamian mythology, the Tablet of Destinies recorded every deed and could not be altered. In Hindu tradition, the god Chitragupta keeps meticulous accounts of every action, every thought, every karmic imprint. In Christian mysticism, the Book of Life contains the names and deeds of all souls. In Norse mythology, the Norns weave fate and memory into an unbreakable tapestry. What these traditions share is the understanding that human existence leaves traces, that consciousness is not a blank slate that can be wiped clean but an accumulating record, and that this record exists somewhere beyond our conscious control, in a realm we might call the subconscious, the soul, the heart, or simply the truth of what we are beneath the stories we tell about ourselves. Modern neuroscience has discovered something the Egyptians intuited thousands of years ago. That memory is not stored in a single location but is distributed throughout the body, that the heart itself contains neural networks, that emotional memory is encoded in ways that bypass conscious awareness, that the body keeps score of trauma, stress, moral conflict, and unresolved guilt. When we speak of a heavy heart, of carrying weight in the chest, of heartache or heartbreak, we are using metaphors that the Egyptians would have recognized as literal descriptions of psychological reality. The fear that the heart might be too heavy, that it might sink when placed upon the scale, is the fear that our hidden emotional truth might outweigh our conscious self-image, that what we have tried to forget or minimize or rationalize might turn out to be the truest thing about us. This myth speaks to the experience of being haunted by the past, of carrying guilt that will not dissolve, of knowing that something within us remembers what we would prefer to forget. The Egyptians understood that the heart was dangerous precisely because it was honest, because it could not participate in the deceptions that make social life possible, because it held the unedited version of experience. In the Hall of Mad, there was no possibility of performing virtue, no way to present a curated version of the self, no appeal to status or eloquence or the opinions of others. There was only the heart, silent and undeniable, resting on one side of the scale, revealing through its weight the accumulated truth of a life. Why does this image still resonate? Because we know, in the depths of our own awareness, that we carry within us this same witness, this same recorder, this part of ourselves that knows what we have done, what we have failed to do, where we have been cruel or cowardly or careless, and this knowledge does not simply disappear when we look away from it. The heart being weighed is a perfect externalization of the internal process of conscience, the way that guilt operates not through punishment imposed from outside, but through the self's recognition of its own violations, its own departures from integrity. Psychologists have long observed that guilt serves an evolutionary function, that it emerges in social species as a mechanism for maintaining cooperation, for regulating behavior within groups, for ensuring that individuals consider the consequences of their actions beyond immediate self-interest. The Egyptians transformed this social-emotional mechanism into cosmic law, suggesting that the universe itself cares about how we treat one another, that there is a fundamental order that extends beyond human society into the very structure of reality. Whether or not such an order objectively exists, The belief in it shapes behavior, creates internal standards, generates the experience of accountability even in the absence of external enforcement. The heart that testifies against its owner is the conscience that will not be silenced, the memory that will not be repressed, the truth that asserts itself despite our best efforts to avoid it. In dreams, this pattern appears as scenarios of exposure, of being unprepared for an examination, of having forgotten something crucial, of being seen for what we really are rather than what we pretend to be. These dreams are not random, but are expressions of the same archetypal anxiety that the Egyptians encoded in the myth of the weighing of the heart, the fear that we are not in control of our own narrative, that something within us or beyond us knows the truth and will eventually reveal it. The spells designed to control the heart, to prevent it from speaking, reveal a deep ambivalence about self-knowledge. The desire to be seen as good conflicts with the awareness of one's actual behavior, and the result is a magical attempt to enforce the preferred narrative, to make the heart comply with the self-image rather than the lived reality. This same ambivalence appears in modern psychological defenses, in rationalization, denial, repression, and projection, all mechanisms by which the conscious mind attempts to manage uncomfortable truths that threaten self-esteem or social belonging. The Egyptians were sophisticated enough to recognize that these defenses were necessary, that without the ability to tell the heart what to say, without the protective spells and formulas, the self would be overwhelmed by its own contradictions, exposed in ways that would make continued existence unbearable. Tonight, as your breathing slows and the edges of waking thought begin to soften, let yourself consider the weight you carry in your own chest, not to judge it or to struggle against it, but simply to acknowledge that it is there, that the heart does remember, that we are all engaged in this ancient negotiation between the truth of what we have been and the hope of being found worthy despite it. And perhaps in this recognition, there is a kind of peace, an acceptance that being human means carrying complexity. Eons living with the tension between who we wish to be and who we actually are, and that this tension is not a flaw but the very condition of consciousness itself. The gods of Egypt did not appear in purely human form, did not present themselves as idealized versions of human beauty or proportion, but instead emerged as hybrids, as impossible fusions of human intelligence and animal essence, figures with the bodies of men and women but the heads of jackals, ibises, hawks, lions, crocodiles, and creatures that defied simple categorization. And this choice was not arbitrary, not merely aesthetic, but reflected a profound psychological understanding of how the human mind constructs meaning, how we see ourselves reflected in the natural world, and how we use animals as symbols to access parts of consciousness that purely human imagery cannot reach. The psychology behind animal gods reveals something essential about the way humans have always experienced the divine, the numinous, the forces that operate beyond rational control, and it suggests that the Egyptians understood what modern depth psychology would later articulate. That the human psyche is not a unified whole but a complex ecosystem of drives, instincts, intelligences, and energies, and that these different aspects of self can be represented, can be given form and personality, through the symbolic language of animal consciousness. When we encounter Anubis, the jackal-headed god who guides souls through the underworld and presides over mummification, we are not meeting a literal being but an archetypal image, a personification of the instinct that knows death intimately, that is comfortable in the liminal spaces between life and decay, that can navigate the territories where human consciousness fears to go. Jackals and wild dogs were scavengers at the edges of Egyptian settlements, creatures that appeared at burial sites, that lived in the threshold zones between the civilized and the wild. And in observing these animals, the Egyptians recognized something that corresponded to a psychological function: the ability to move between worlds, to handle what is taboo, to perform the necessary work of transformation that occurs in darkness. Anubis is the part of the psyche that can face death without flinching, that can engage with the processes of ending and transition, that understands that decay is not the opposite of life but part of the same continuum. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, magic, and the moon, represents a different kind of intelligence, the consciousness that observes, records, calculates, and mediates between opposing forces. The ibis is a bird that walks in water and mud, searching carefully for food, moving with precision and patience. And in this behavior, the Egyptians saw a reflection of the mind that operates through careful attention, through the slow accumulation of knowledge, through the ability to find meaning in what appears chaotic or obscure. Thoth is the psyche's capacity for symbolic thought, for language, for the translation of experience into pattern and memory, and his animal form suggests that this capacity is not uniquely human, but is connected to a broader intelligence that exists in nature itself, in the way that all living things navigate their environments, solve problems, and adapt to change. Sekhmet, the lioness-headed goddess of war, destruction, healing, and transformation, embodies the terrifying power of rage, the force that can destroy but also purify, the energy that cannot be controlled through reason but must be respected, channeled, or appeased. Lions were apex predators in the Egyptian imagination, creatures of overwhelming power and beauty, and the lioness in particular represented focused, deadly efficiency, the mother who kills to protect, the warrior who shows no mercy. In giving this form to a goddess, the Egyptians were acknowledging something that modern psychology recognizes in the concept of the shadow, the reality that human beings contain within themselves capacities for violence, for destruction, for ferocity that cannot be eliminated but must be integrated, must be given recognition and appropriate expression, or else these energies turn inward, becoming self-destructive, or erupt uncontrollably, becoming chaos. Sekhmet is not evil. She is necessary. She is the immune system of the psyche, the response to violation, the refusal to accept what should not be tolerated, and her animal form makes this clear. She is not a moral principle that can be debated but a force that simply is, that operates according to its own nature, that must be honored rather than denied. Bastet, the cat-headed goddess of home, fertility, joy, and protection, represents the domesticated, the playful, the sensual, the capacity for pleasure and comfort that balances the harsher necessities of survival. Cats in Egypt were beloved companions, protectors of grain stores from rodents, creatures that moved between independence and affection. And in this dual nature, the Egyptians recognized something about the part of the self that knows how to rest, how to enjoy, how to create sanctuary even in a dangerous world. The choice to represent deities as animal-human hybrids rather than as purely human or purely animal forms is psychologically significant because it suggests a consciousness that did not see sharp divisions between human and nature, between reason and instinct, between civilization and wildness, but instead understood these as existing on a continuum, as aspects of a single interconnected reality. Modern evolutionary psychology has confirmed what the Egyptians intuited, that human consciousness emerges from animal consciousness, that our brains contain ancient structures that we share with other mammals, reptiles, and even more distant ancestors, and that these older layers of neural organization continue to influence behavior, emotion, and perception, even when we believe ourselves to be operating purely through rational thought. The animal gods are maps of these deeper structures, ways of personifying the drives and intelligences that operate beneath conscious awareness. And by giving them divine status, by treating them with reverence and ritual attention, the Egyptians were engaging in what we might now call psychological integration, the process of bringing unconscious material into relationship with consciousness, of acknowledging that we are more than our thinking minds, that we contain within us the hawk's vision, the jackal's comfort with death, the crocodile's patience, the lion's rage, and the cat's pleasure in simple existence. Cross-cultural mythology reveals that this impulse to see the divine in animal form is nearly universal. Native American traditions speak of animal spirits and totems. Hindu deities take animal forms or ride upon animal vehicles. Greek gods transform into animals or are accompanied by sacred creatures. Norse mythology includes wolves, ravens, serpents, and eagles as divine messengers and companions. Shamanic traditions worldwide involve shape-shifting, animal possession, and the dissolution of boundaries between human and animal consciousness. What these traditions share is the recognition that animals embody qualities in pure, undiluted form, that they live without the complications of human self-consciousness, without doubt or internal conflict about what they are, and that in contemplating them, in imaginatively merging with them, human beings can access these same qualities within themselves. The psychology of animal gods is ultimately about reconnection with instinct, with the body's wisdom, with the forms of intelligence that do not operate through language or analysis, but through sensation, intuition, and immediate response to environment. In modern life, where human experience is increasingly mediated by technology, by abstract systems, by constant cognitive processing, the animal within us becomes estranged, forgotten, pathologized as primitive or irrational. And yet it continues to assert itself in dreams, in sudden emotional responses, in physical symptoms that speak what consciousness will not acknowledge. The Egyptians, by elevating animal gods to the highest levels of their pantheon, were maintaining a relationship with these deeper aspects of being, were ensuring that the instinctual, the embodied, the wild remained integrated into the sacred order rather than split off and feared. Tonight, as you move towards sleep, as conscious control begins to release and the mind drifts into less structured forms of thought, you might notice how easily you can imagine being something other than human, how natural it feels to see through different eyes, to move through the world with a different body, to know through sense rather than concept. And this ease is not imagination imposing itself on emptiness, but the recognition of what already exists within you. The ancient layers of consciousness that the Egyptians honored when they shaped their gods with animal heads and human hearts. The sun, to the ancient Egyptians, was not simply a celestial body that provided light and warmth, not merely a predictable astronomical phenomenon that marked the passage of days, but something far more precarious, far more threatened, something that required constant protection, constant vigilance, constant ritual reinforcement to ensure that it would rise again after its nightly descent into the underworld. And this anxiety about the sun's survival reveals a profound psychological pattern. The fear that consciousness itself might fail, that the light which makes existence comprehensible might be extinguished, that darkness is not a passive absence but an active force seeking to prevent the return of awareness. The myth of Ra's nightly journey through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, describes a cosmos in which nothing is guaranteed, in which the sun god must navigate 12 hours of darkness, passing through gates guarded by demons, sailing upon a celestial river through territories where the rules of the upper world do not apply. And at a certain hour in the deepest part of the night, he encounters Apophis, the great serpent of chaos, the embodiment of everything that opposes order, light, structure, and meaning. Apophis does not merely attack Ra. He seeks to swallow him entirely, to consume the sun and prevent dawn from ever occurring, to return the cosmos to the primordial state of undifferentiated darkness that existed before creation. And this is not death as transformation, but annihilation as absolute negation. The end of time, the end of differentiation, the end of consciousness itself. Every night, according to the mythology, Ra's solar bark is defended by a retinue of gods who fight against Apophis, who use spells and weapons to drive the serpent back, to wound it sufficiently that Ra can pass through the final gates of the underworld and emerge victorious at dawn, reborn, renewed, continuing the cycle that makes life possible. The Egyptians understood that this battle was never finally won, that Apophis could not be killed permanently but would always return the following night, that the threat to cosmic order was not something that could be eliminated once and for all, but was instead a permanent condition of existence, requiring eternal vigilance, eternal effort, eternal repetition of the protective rituals that kept chaos at bay. This myth is not about external astronomical mechanics, but about internal psychological experience, about the way consciousness feels fragile, about the way awareness can feel threatened by forces that seem overwhelming, about the daily struggle to maintain coherence in the face of confusion, despair, meaninglessness, and dissolution. The sun as consciousness appears across human mythology in remarkably consistent patterns. In Greek tradition, Helios drives his chariot across the sky, and if he loses control, the world burns or freezes. In Norse mythology, the sun is pulled by horses and chased by a wolf that will eventually devour it at Ragnarok. In Japanese tradition, the sun goddess Amaterasu once hid in a cave, plunging the world into darkness until she was lured back out. In Vedic mythology, the sun must be constantly hymned and praised to ensure its continued journey. What these traditions share is the intuition that light, order, and consciousness are not the default state of reality but are achievements, are victories that must be won repeatedly, and that the forces of chaos, darkness, and unconsciousness are always present, always threatening, always requiring resistance. Modern psychology understands this pattern through the lens of circadian rhythm, of sleep-wake cycles, of the way that consciousness naturally dissolves each night into unconsciousness, and of the anxiety that can accompany this dissolution, the fear that sleep might become something from which one does not wake, that the self might not survive the journey into darkness. The sun's nightly journey through the underworld is a perfect metaphor for what happens when we close our eyes, when we surrender conscious control, when we enter the realm where the rules of waking life do not apply, where time behaves strangely, where identity becomes fluid, where we encounter images and presences that we did not consciously create and cannot fully control. The serpent Apophis represents everything that threatens this journey, every force that would prevent the return to consciousness, whether that force is depression, trauma, existential despair, or simply the gravitational pull toward non-being that every living thing must resist. The fact that Apophis cannot be permanently defeated, but must be fought every single night reflects the reality of psychological maintenance. The understanding that mental health is not a state that is achieved and then maintained effortlessly, but is instead a daily practice, a continuous choosing of engagement over withdrawal, of meaning over nihilism, of structure over chaos. The Egyptians performed rituals at dawn to celebrate Ra's victory, to reinforce through human action the divine pattern, to participate in the maintenance of cosmic order. And these rituals served a psychological function. They created a narrative framework in which the return of consciousness each morning was not taken for granted, but was recognized as significant, as worthy of gratitude, as a victory in an ongoing struggle. In contemporary life, where electric light has largely dissolved the dramatic distinction between day and night, where we can extend waking consciousness far beyond natural limits, there is often a loss of this ritual relationship with darkness, a tendency to treat sleep as an inconvenience rather than as a necessary journey. And yet the ancient patterns remain encoded in the psyche, and many people experience anxiety around sleep, fear of losing control, nightmare, of being trapped or pursued or unable to escape, all echoes of the same archetypal pattern that the Egyptians expressed through the myth of Apophis threatening the solar bark. The psychological need to protect the sun, to ensure that light will return, speaks to something fundamental about human consciousness. That awareness is experienced as precious, as something that can be lost, as something worth defending against forces that feel larger, older, more powerful than the fragile self. When we speak of fighting through depression, of struggling to get out of bed in the morning, of forcing ourselves back into engagement with life when everything feels dark and meaningless, we are reenacting the same battle that Ra fights against Apophis. We are experiencing the same cosmic drama on an individual scale, and the mythology gives shape and dignity to this struggle, suggests that it is not a personal failing but a participation in the fundamental structure of existence itself. The sun must be protected because consciousness must be protected, because the capacity to experience, to witness, to create meaning from sensation is not guaranteed, is always under threat, and requires from us a kind of courage, a willingness to enter darkness knowing that we might not return unchanged, might not return at all, and yet trusting that the journey is necessary, that dawn will come if we can only endure the passage through night. Cross-cultural solar mythology reveals that this anxiety about the sun's survival is nearly universal, that human beings everywhere have looked at the daily cycle of light and darkness and seen in it a metaphor for life and death, for hope and despair, for the possibility of renewal and the threat of extinction. And this universality suggests that we are not dealing with culturally specific beliefs, but with fundamental features of human psychology, with the way that consciousness experiences itself as both powerful and vulnerable, as both the center of meaning and a fragile phenomenon that could end at any moment. Tonight, as you prepare to make your own journey into darkness, as you feel the day's tensions beginning to release and the familiar anchors of identity starting to loosen, you might recognize that you are participating in the same ancient pattern, that you are the sun descending into the underworld, that you will encounter in dreams, and in the void of deep sleep the same forces of chaos and dissolution that the Egyptians personified as Apophis. And yet there is also in this recognition a kind of reassurance. Because the myth tells us that this journey has been made countless times before, that dawn has always returned, that consciousness has proven resilient enough to survive the nightly voyage through its own absence, and that in trusting this pattern, in allowing yourself to descend without resistance, you are not falling into danger but following a path as old as awareness itself. The underworld in Egyptian mythology was not a vague realm of shadows or an abstract concept of afterlife, but a precisely mapped geography of terror, a landscape with specific locations, named demons, guarded gates, rivers of fire, halls of judgment, and regions where the rules of ordinary existence dissolved into nightmare logic. And this elaborate cartography of death reveals something essential about the human relationship with the unknown, the need to give form to what cannot be seen, to name what cannot be controlled, to create a map even of territories that exist beyond the reach of living experience. The Duat, as the Egyptians called their underworld, was a place that souls entered immediately upon death, a realm that existed somehow beneath the earth yet also in the sky, a dimension that interpenetrated the visible world but remained hidden from ordinary perception. And to navigate it required knowledge, required spells and passwords and magical formulas, required guidance from gods who knew the paths and could protect the vulnerable soul from the countless dangers that waited in the darkness. Why did humans fear the underworld so profoundly that they created these detailed maps, these elaborate survival guides, these protective rituals designed to ensure safe passage through a realm that by definition could not be empirically verified? Because the underworld is not truly a place but a psychological state, a representation of everything that consciousness cannot integrate, everything that has been rejected, repressed, denied, or simply remains unknown. And the journey through it is the journey that every individual must eventually make, the confrontation with the aspects of self and reality that waking life allows us to avoid. The Egyptian underworld contained regions of fire and regions of ice, serpents that could kill with a glance, lakes of boiling water, demons armed with knives who threatened to dismember the soul, gates that would not open without the correct magical phrase, and darkness so complete that it could be felt as a physical presence. And each of these obstacles represents a different form of psychological challenge, a different way that the encounter with death and the unconscious can feel threatening to the coherence of identity. In Greek mythology, the underworld is Hades, a place of shades and forgetting, where the river Lethe dissolves memory and the ferryman Charon requires payment to cross the boundary between life and death. In Norse tradition, hell is a cold realm of those who did not die in battle, a place without glory or warmth. In Mesoamerican mythology, Xibalba is a realm of tests and tortures where the lords of death play cruel games with arriving souls. In Christian tradition, hell becomes a place of eternal punishment, a geography of suffering organized by sin. In Buddhist cosmology, there are multiple hell realms corresponding to different karmic debts, each meticulously described in terms of the suffering appropriate to specific transgressions. What all these traditions share is the impulse to give structure to what lies beyond life, to transform the terror of the unknown into something that can be navigated, survived, perhaps even transcended. And this impulse reveals the human need for narrative coherence, for the sense that existence follows comprehensible patterns even in realms where ordinary rules no longer apply. The fear of the underworld is ultimately the fear of losing oneself, of fragmenting, of encountering forces and presences that overwhelm the boundaries of identity. And in psychological terms, this fear corresponds to what happens in extreme trauma, in psychotic breaks, in ego dissolution experiences, in any state where the ordinary sense of self cannot maintain its integrity. The Egyptians understood this, which is why their funerary texts are filled with spells designed to preserve identity, to ensure that the deceased can remember their own name, can speak their own truth, can maintain continuity of consciousness even as they pass through territories designed to erase, confuse, and destroy. The Book of the Dead, that collection of spells and instructions for navigating the afterlife, is not a primitive superstition, but a sophisticated psychological manual, a guide for maintaining awareness through states of extreme disorientation. And its modern equivalents might be found in meditation instructions, in psychedelic integration practices, in therapeutic approaches to working with trauma and dissociation, in any methodology that attempts to provide structure and guidance for consciousness as it encounters the limits of its own ordinary functioning. The demons of the underworld are not external beings, but personifications of internal states, of the rage, shame, terror, and despair that can surface when the defenses of the ego are stripped away, when there is no longer any social role to perform, any identity to maintain, any distraction from the raw end. counter with what one has been and what one has avoided. In dreams, the underworld appears as basements, caves, tunnels, dark forests, abandoned buildings, any location that feels below, hidden, removed from the safe and familiar territories of waking life. And the encounters that occur in these spaces often have the quality of initiation, of being tested, of having to face something difficult in order to emerge transformed. Jungian psychology recognized the underworld journey as a necessary phase of individuation, the process by which the self becomes whole through integrating what has been split off, shadow material that must be encountered, acknowledged, and brought into relationship with consciousness. And Jung observed that this journey could not be avoided, that those who tried to remain only in the daylight world, only in the realm of persona and social acceptability, eventually found themselves pulled into the underworld involuntarily, through depression, breakdown, or crisis, because the psyche demands wholeness and will create conditions that force the confrontation that has been avoided. The underworld is not punishment but pedagogy, not a place of meaningless suffering, but a realm of transformation where the superficial is burned away, and what remains is either essential or is revealed as having been illusion all along. The Egyptians understood this transformative function, which is why Ra himself had to journey through the Duat each night, why even the sun god could not remain forever in the upper world but had to descend, had to pass through darkness, had to be temporarily reduced and threatened before emerging renewed at dawn. This pattern appears in hero myths across all cultures. The descent into the cave, the belly of the whale, the labyrinth, the forest of trials, always a journey downward or inward, into darkness, into danger, into a place where the ordinary self cannot survive intact. And those who return from this journey are changed, are marked by it, carry knowledge that cannot be unlearned. Modern individuals often experience this pattern through grief, through depression, through illness, through any life event that removes them from normal functioning and forces a confrontation with vulnerability, mortality, and the limits of control. And during these experiences, the mythological language of the underworld can provide a framework, can suggest that what feels like meaningless suffering is actually a necessary passage, that there is a path through even the darkest territories, that others have made this journey before and have left markers, instructions, ways of understanding what is happening. The fear of the underworld diminishes when it is recognized not as an enemy but as a teacher, not as annihilation but as transformation, not as the end of self, but as the dissolution of what was never truly self to begin with, the false structures and defenses that have exhausted themselves and must be released before something more authentic can emerge. Tonight, as you descend into sleep, as consciousness withdraws from the external world and turns inward, you are making your own journey through the underworld. You are following the path that Ra follows each night. And though the journey may take you through strange territories, though you may encounter images and sensations that feel threatening or confusing, the mythology reminds you that this passage has been made countless times, that the underworld is not a place you go to die, but a place you go to be transformed. And that on the other side of darkness, if you can trust the journey, if you can release the need to control every moment, dawn will come, and you will emerge, as the sun emerges, renewed and ready once again for the work of consciousness in the daylit world. The practice of mummification, that elaborate and meticulous process by which the Egyptians preserved the physical body after death, removing organs, desiccating flesh with natron salts, wrapping the remains in layers upon layers of linen, anointing with oils and resins, encasing the finished work in decorated coffins and stone sarcophagi, was not simply a cultural tradition or a technical achievement, but a profound psychological statement about the relationship between identity and embodiment, about the terror of dissolution, and about the human need to maintain continuity across the boundary of death. The subconscious meaning of mummification reveals an anxiety that goes far deeper than the fear of death itself. It is the fear of fragmentation, the fear that without the body as anchor, the self will scatter into nothingness, that identity requires physical substrate, that consciousness cannot exist as pure spirit but needs the container of flesh to maintain coherence and continuity. The Egyptians believed that a person was not a single unified entity but a composite of multiple elements, each with its own nature and requirements. The physical body, called the Khat, wick. H was the material form subject to decay. The Ka, which was the life force or vital essence, a kind of spiritual double that required sustenance even after death. The Ba, often depicted as a bird with a human head, which was the personality, the aspect of self that could move between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The Ak, which was the transfigured spirit that could only come into being after death if the proper rituals were performed. And the Ib, the heart, which we have already encountered as the seat of memory and moral truth, the part that would be weighed in judgment. This complex anthropology reveals a sophisticated understanding that identity is not simple, that what we call the self is actually multiple processes and aspects that normally function together but can potentially separate. And the elaborate funerary practices were designed to ensure that these elements remained in proper relationship, that the Ka would have a body to return to, that the Ba could find its way back to the tomb, that the Ak could successfully navigate the transformation from living person to transfigured ancestor. Mummification was an attempt to stop time, to prevent the natural process of decomposition, to assert human control over biology itself. And in this, we can see a profound expression of the terror of change, the anxiety that accompanies any transformation that cannot be reversed, any process that moves in only one direction and cannot be undone. The body in ancient Egyptian thought was not merely a vessel for the soul but was essential to personal identity, was the form through which the self had experienced the world, and to lose this form entirely was to risk losing the continuity of selfhood, to become unmoored from the accumulated experience of a lifetime. Modern psychology recognizes similar anxieties in body dysmorphia, in the fear of aging, in the psychological trauma that can accompany disfigurement or the loss of physical abilities, in the way that people whose bodies change dramatically through illness or accident often report feeling alienated from themselves, as though they have lost not just physical function, but something essential to their sense of who they are. The Egyptians, in their insistence on preserving the body, were acknowledging that embodiment matters, that we are not ghosts trapped in meat, but beings whose consciousness is inseparable from the particular flesh we have inhabited, and that to preserve identity across death required preserving, as much as possible, the physical form that had been the vehicle and expression of that identity during life. The process of mummification itself was a ritual of transformation, a sacred technology performed by priests who wore masks of Anubis, who reenacted through their careful work the original mummification of Osiris, the god who had been murdered, dismembered, and then restored through the magic of his wife Isis. And in this reenactment, every deceased person became Osiris, became the one who dies and is reborn, who is torn apart and made whole, who descends into death and emerges as a transfigured being. This is not simply preservation but transformation, not just the maintenance of what was but the creation of what will be. And the mummy is not a corpse but a chrysalis, a form in which the self undergoes metamorphosis from mortal to immortal, from limited to eternal, from bound by time to existing beyond time. Cross-cultural parallels to this practice reveal that the anxiety about bodily dissolution and the desire to maintain physical continuity after death is not unique to Egypt. In some Buddhist traditions, the bodies of highly realized masters are preserved and venerated. In Christian tradition, the bodies of saints are kept as relics and are believed to retain sacred power. In Andean cultures, mummies of ancestors were kept in households and brought out for festivals, maintaining an active relationship between the living and the dead. In modern secular culture, the rise of cryonics, the freezing of bodies or brains with the hope of future revival, reveals the same deep anxiety about the finality of physical death. The same hope that if the body can be preserved, identity might somehow be maintained until technology can restore life. The fear that mummification addresses is ultimately the fear of being forgotten, of dissolving not just physically but also from memory, from significance, from the continuity of human relationship and meaning. And in this sense, the preserved body is a monument, a physical anchor that insists that this person existed, that this life mattered, that this identity should not be allowed to simply vanish into the undifferentiated past. The elaborate tombs, the grave goods, the food offerings, the inscriptions of names and titles, all serve this same function. They are attempts to maintain presence, to ensure that the deceased continues to exist in some form within the world of the living. Contin, used to be spoken of, thought about, included in the community even after biological death. Modern equivalents might be found in digital immortality projects, in social media profiles that persist after death, in the ways that people create archives and memoirs and autobiographies, in the impulse to leave something behind that will survive the death of the body, that will maintain some continuity of self beyond the biological limit. The Egyptians understood that memory requires anchors, that to be remembered requires something physical that can be returned to, looked at, touched, and in preserving the body they were creating the ultimate anchor, the most direct and undeniable evidence that this person had existed, had occupied space, had been real. The anxiety that drives mummification is the anxiety of impermanence, the recognition that everything changes, that nothing lasts, that the self we have spent a lifetime constructing will eventually dissolve. And the attempt to preserve the body is an attempt to say no to this fundamental law, to insist that at least this one thing will not change, will not decay, will not disappear. And though we know now that even the most carefully preserved mummies eventually deteriorate, that no physical preservation can truly be permanent, the impulse itself reveals something profound about human consciousness, about the way we experience ourselves as continuous entities moving through time, and about the deep disturbance that occurs when we confront the fact that this continuity will end. Tonight, as your body settles into stillness, as muscles relax and breathing slows and the busy activity of the day gives way to the quiet of approaching sleep, you might notice how consciousness begins to loosen its grip on the physical form, how the boundaries of the body start to feel less distinct, how awareness drifts away from sensation and toward something more abstract, more fluid. And in this nightly dissolution there is a small rehearsal of death, a temporary release of the self from the body. And perhaps in allowing this release without fear, in trusting that consciousness will return, that the self will reintegrate with the body in the morning, you are practicing something that the Egyptians sought through all their elaborate rituals. The ability to let go of control, to surrender to transformation, to trust that identity can survive passage through states where it seems to dissolve, and to know that preservation is not about keeping everything exactly as it was, but about maintaining the essential pattern, the core of what matters, through whatever changes must come. Death, in the Egyptian understanding, could not simply be allowed to happen, could not be trusted to unfold according to its own natural rhythms, but had to be managed, controlled, guided, surrounded by ritual, encased in procedure, transformed from a chaotic dissolution into an orderly transition governed by rules, spells, maps, and protective formulas. And this obsessive need to control death, to leave nothing to chance, to prepare for every possible danger and obstacle in the afterlife, reveals a profound psychological pattern that extends far beyond ancient Egypt and speaks to the human relationship with uncertainty, with the unknown, and with experiences that lie beyond the reach of conscious mastery. The funerary practices of ancient Egypt were staggeringly elaborate, involving not just mummification but the construction of tombs that could take decades to complete, the commissioning of funerary texts personalized for each individual, the provision of grave goods including food, drink, clothing, furniture, jewelry, tools, weapons, and even servant figures called ushabti that would magically come to life in the afterlife to perform labor on behalf of the deceased. The performance of ceremonies and offerings that continued for years or even generations after death, and the creation of detailed instructions for navigating every stage of the journey through the Duat, every gate that must be passed, every demon that must be placated, every word that must be spoken to ensure safe passage. This level of preparation suggests an anxiety so profound that it could not be satisfied with simple trust or faith, but required the creation of comprehensive systems, detailed plans, backup strategies for every contingency. And the underlying message of all this elaborate preparation was that death was dangerous, that the afterlife was full of threats, that without proper knowledge and proper protection, the soul could be destroyed, lost, or condemned to eternal suffering. Why did death need to be so thoroughly controlled? Because death represents the ultimate loss of control, the moment when all human planning, all accumulated knowledge, all social status and personal power become irrelevant, when the individual must face a transition that cannot be avoided, cannot be postponed indefinitely, cannot be managed through the usual strategies that work in life. And this absolute unavoidability, this non-negotiable nature of death, creates an anxiety that the human mind struggles to tolerate. The Egyptian response was to transform death from an event beyond control into a process that could be controlled, or at least influenced, through proper preparation. And in this transformation there is both wisdom and delusion. Wisdom in recognizing that how one approaches death matters, that preparation and ritual can provide psychological support during profound transition, but delusion in believing that sufficient preparation could eliminate all danger, that death could be made safe, that the unknown could be fully mapped and therefore mastered. Modern psychology recognizes this pattern in obsessive-compulsive behaviors, in the way that anxiety often manifests as a need for control, as rituals that must be performed perfectly, as contingency planning that spirals into exhaustive attempts to anticipate every possible problem. And while these behaviors can provide temporary relief from anxiety, they ultimately reinforce the belief that safety requires total control, that letting go of vigilance means inviting catastrophe. The Egyptians created a culture-wide version of this pattern, turning the management of death into a central organizing principle of society. And the result was a civilization that produced monuments of staggering ambition and beauty, texts of profound psychological insight, and also a population that lived under the constant pressure of death anxiety, the knowledge that their eternal fate depended on proper performance of complex rituals, proper preservation of the body, proper provision of offerings, proper memorization of spells, and proper behavior throughout life as recorded by the ever-watching gods. The Book of the Dead, that vast collection of funerary spells and instructions, reveals the extent of this need for control. There are spells for preventing the heart from testifying against its owner, spells for preventing the deceased from having to eat excrement in the afterlife, spells for preventing decapitation, spells for breathing, for remembering one's name, for having power over water, for not dying again in the realm of the dead, for transforming into various forms, for navigating through gates, for repelling demons, and the existence of these highly specific spells suggests an anxiety so detailed, so comprehensive, that it had imagined every possible horror and created a magical defense against it. This is the psychology of over-control, the belief that sufficient preparation can eliminate risk, that the unknown can be rendered known through exhaustive catalog of possibilities. And while this approach creates the illusion of safety, it also creates enormous burden, because perfect performance is impossible, because no preparation can truly be complete, because the future, and especially the future beyond death, contains genuine uncertainty that no amount of planning can eliminate. Cross-cultural examination reveals that many traditions developed elaborate death rituals, but few reached the level of systematic detail found in Egypt. Tibetan Buddhism created the Bardo Thodol, the so-called Tibetan Book of the Dead, which provides instructions for navigating the intermediate state between death and rebirth. But the emphasis is less on control and more on recognition, on seeing through illusion, on releasing attachment rather than ensuring favorable outcomes through proper procedure. Christian tradition developed prayers for the dying and funeral rites, but salvation was understood to depend on grace rather than on perfect execution of ritual. Indigenous traditions often emphasize the importance of proper burial and respect for ancestors, but generally without the anxiety-driven elaboration found in Egyptian practice. The question is not whether death rituals are valuable, whether preparation for mortality is wise, but rather what relationship with death these rituals express. Do they emerge from acceptance and reverence, or from fear and the need to control? The Egyptian approach, for all its magnificence, carries the signature of the latter, the sense that death was primarily a threat to be managed rather than a natural transition to be honored. And this orientation created a civilization that was, in many ways, organized around death rather than life, that poured vast resources into tombs and afterlife preparation, while the living struggled under heavy taxation and forced labor to build monuments for the dead. Modern secular culture often swings to the opposite extreme, attempting to avoid thinking about death entirely, relegating it to hospitals and funeral homes, speaking of it in euphemisms, refusing to engage with mortality until it forces itself into awareness through crisis. And this avoidance is itself a form of anxiety, a different strategy for dealing with the same underlying discomfort that the Egyptian addressed through obsessive preparation. The middle path, suggested by various wisdom traditions, is neither obsessive control nor avoidance, but rather conscious relationship, the ability to hold awareness of mortality without being dominated by fear of it, to prepare practically without believing that preparation can eliminate all uncertainty, to face the unknown with both appropriate caution and fundamental trust that consciousness itself has resilience that transcends any particular strategy or system. The Egyptians, in their elaborate over-control of death, were attempting to create certainty in a domain that is essentially uncertain. And while their rituals and texts contain genuine wisdom about psychology, symbolism, and the stages of transformation, the underlying anxiety that drove the system reveals the limitation of any approach that believes safety comes from total control rather than from the capacity to navigate uncertainty with flexibility and presence. Tonight, as you approach sleep, that small death that occurs each day, you might notice your own relationship with control, the way that anxiety often manifests as mental activity, as planning, as rehearsing possible problems, as trying to anticipate and manage the future before it arrives. And in noticing this pattern without judgment, simply recognizing it as a natural response to uncertainty, you might also discover that there is another possibility, that consciousness can release the need to control, can allow the transition into sleep to occur without managing every moment, can trust that the process has its own intelligence, its own rhythm, and that safety comes not from perfect preparation but from the ability to move with change rather than against it, to participate in transformation rather than resisting it. And in this release, there is a kind of peace that no amount of control can provide, a peace that the ancient Egyptians, for all their wisdom and all their elaborate rituals, may have glimpsed only in moments when the burden of preparation finally lifted, and they allowed themselves simply to surrender to what was always going to happen regardless of how carefully they had planned. The concept of an eternal afterlife, the belief that consciousness continues not just beyond death but continues forever, stretching into infinite time without end, without cessation, without the possibility of final rest, reveals something profound and paradoxical about human psychology. That we cannot accept the idea of absolute ending, that the mind recoils from the concept of its own non-existence, and yet the solution we create, the promise of eternity, carries within it anxieties and implications that are rarely examined, because to truly contemplate forever is to encounter a different kind of terror, the terror not of ending but of never ending, of existence without the boundary that gives meaning to time, of consciousness stretched across an incomprehensible duration that makes even the longest human life seem like a single heartbeat. The Egyptian vision of the afterlife, particularly the field of reeds, was not a place of eternal worship or spiritual transcendence, but rather a continuation of earthly life under ideal conditions. Abundant harvests, no disease, no conflict, the presence of loved ones, the ability to engage in pleasurable activities, a perfected version of the world the Egyptians had known during their mortal existence. And this vision reveals something essential about what humans actually want when they imagine life after death, which is not radical transformation into something unrecognizable, but rather the preservation of identity, relationships, and experiences they have valued, freed from the suffering and limitation that made earthly life difficult. This is wish fulfillment at its most transparent, the projection of desire onto the blank screen of the unknowable. And while there is nothing wrong with hope, with the creation of comforting images to help navigate the fear of death, the psychology behind eternal afterlife beliefs deserves examination because it shapes behavior, creates expectations, generates anxieties of its own, and reveals assumptions about the nature of self and consciousness that may or may not correspond to reality. Why do humans find it so difficult to accept that consciousness might end, that the self might simply cease to exist, that death might be final in a way that allows no continuation, no awareness, no experience of any kind? Evolutionary psychology suggests that consciousness evolved as a survival mechanism, that the ability to model future scenarios, to plan, to remember, to maintain a continuous sense of self over time provided enormous adaptive advantages. And consciousness that can imagine its own future necessarily has difficulty imagining its own absence, because the very act of imagining requires a consciousness that is present to do the imagining, creating a logical paradox where the self cannot truly conceive of its own non-existence except as another form of existence, as darkness, as void, as something, when actual non-existence would be no experience at all, no darkness, no void, no awareness of absence. The mind, unable to grasp this concept experientially, defaults to the assumption of continuity, And from this cognitive limitation or bias arise the various religious and philosophical frameworks that promise life after death, reincarnation, spiritual immortality, or absorption into a cosmic consciousness that transcends individual identity while somehow preserving something essential. The Egyptian afterlife is particularly interesting because it does not involve dissolution of the self into the divine, but rather the preservation and even enhancement of individual identity. The deceased retains their name, their personality, their memories, their relationships, and continues as a distinct being, a perfected version of who they were in life. And this reflects a deep attachment to selfhood, a refusal to accept that what has taken a lifetime to construct might simply end, that all the accumulated experience, knowledge, and relationship might dissolve without remainder. Modern neuroscience, which understands consciousness as an emergent property of neural activity, suggests that when brain function ceases, the subjective experience that we call self also ceases, that there is no ghost in the machine, no separate soul that can continue independently of the physical substrate that generated it. And while this materialist perspective is supported by evidence and is intellectually compelling, it remains psychologically difficult for many people to accept. Because it means that everything we are, everything we have experienced, every relationship we have formed, will end absolutely and finally with death, leaving no trace except in the memories of those who survive us, and eventually, when they too die, leaving nothing at all. This thought is so disturbing to most people that they actively avoid contemplating it, preferring instead the comfort of afterlife beliefs. And there is no judgment in observing this, because the capacity to live with meaning and purpose in the face of mortality, without requiring the promise of eternal continuation, is rare and requires a particular kind of psychological strength, or perhaps a different relationship with time, identity, and value. The promise of eternal afterlife serves multiple psychological functions. It provides comfort in the face of death anxiety, creates motivation for moral behavior through the promise of reward and threat of punishment, offers hope for reunion with deceased loved ones, suggests that injustices suffered during life will be corrected in the afterlife, and perhaps most fundamentally, validates the feeling that consciousness is precious, that awareness matters, that existence is not random or meaningless, but has purpose that extends beyond biological survival and reproduction. These are not trivial functions, and afterlife beliefs have provided genuine psychological support for countless individuals facing death, grief, suffering, and existential questioning. And yet there is also a cost to organizing life around beliefs that may not be true, that may be wishful thinking rather than insight into the nature of reality. And the cost is that energy and attention go into preparation for a hypothetical future at the expense of full engagement with present experience. That moral behavior becomes transactional rather than intrinsically motivated. That suffering is endured rather than addressed because true justice is expected only in the next world. And that the finitude of life, which could create urgency and appreciation, is diluted by the belief that there will always be more time, infinite time, in the eternity that follows. Cross-cultural afterlife beliefs reveal enormous variety. Some traditions promise heaven or paradise for the righteous. Some threaten hell for the wicked. Some describe reincarnation through countless lives. Some speak of ancestor realms where the dead continue to influence the living. Some envision absorption into undifferentiated unity. Some suggest that only certain aspects of the self continue while others dissolve. And this variety itself suggests that these beliefs are cultural constructions rather than accurate descriptions of objective reality. Because if there were a single true afterlife, we might expect convergence rather than divergence in how different cultures describe it. The Egyptians themselves changed their afterlife beliefs over time, with different periods emphasizing different aspects, different gods, different requirements for successful transition. And this evolution reveals that even within a single culture, afterlife concepts are fluid, responsive to social conditions, influenced by priesthoods and political structures, shaped by the psychological needs of particular historical moments. Psychology behind eternal afterlife is ultimately the psychology of hope, of the refusal to accept limits, of the insistence that consciousness is too valuable to simply end. And while this hope has inspired magnificent art, architecture, literature, and philosophy, while it has comforted millions in their final moments and helped survivors process grief, it is worth asking whether the same psychological needs might be met in other ways, whether meaning and value can be found in finite existence, whether consciousness can be appreciated precisely because it is temporary, whether the urgency created by mortality might actually enhance rather than diminish the quality of experience. Tonight, as you move towards sleep, you are practicing a kind of small death, a temporary cessation of waking consciousness, and the ease with which you can surrender to this nightly dissolution, trusting that you will wake in the morning, suggests that consciousness has less fear of interruption than we might imagine, that the self can tolerate gaps, can survive periods of absence, can release control without anxiety, and perhaps in this daily practice of letting go there is a teaching about death itself. A suggestion that the end of consciousness might not be the catastrophe that our waking minds imagine, that there might be a natural grace in the completion of a lifetime, in the full stop that allows the sentence to have meaning, in the ending that makes the story complete rather than leaving it perpetually unfinished, hanging in an eternity that knows no resolution and therefore no peace. Darkness in the Egyptian cosmological framework was not merely the absence of light, not simply a neutral condition that occurred when the sun descended below the horizon, but was instead understood as an active force, a threatening presence with its own agency and intention, a manifestation of Isfet, the principle of chaos, disorder, and the dissolution of all structure. And this conception of darkness as fundamentally hostile to existence reveals a psychological pattern that extends far beyond ancient Egypt and speaks to something primal in human consciousness. The way that absence of light triggers ancient survival fears, activates threat detection systems evolved over millions of years when darkness truly did conceal predators and dangers, and creates a symbolic vocabulary through which the mind represents all that threatens meaning, order, identity, and life itself. The Egyptian concept of Ma'at, often translated as truth, justice, or cosmic order, represented the fundamental structure of reality, the way things should be, the proper arrangement of elements that allowed life to flourish, society to function, consciousness to comprehend the world. And Ma'at was not automatic, was not self-maintaining, but required constant reinforcement through ritual, through ethical behavior, through the proper performance of religious duties, through the maintenance of social hierarchies and traditions, because always pressing against Ma'at was its opposite, Isfet, the force of entropy, dissolution, confusion, and return to the undifferentiated chaos that existed before creation. Darkness was the visible manifestation of Isfet, the time when Ma'at was most vulnerable, when the boundaries between things became unclear, when the ordered world threatened to dissolve back into primordial nothingness. And this is why night required protection, why the sun's journey through the underworld was fraught with danger, why demons and hostile forces were understood to be most active in darkness, and why the return of dawn was celebrated not as a predictable astronomical event, but as a victory, as the reassertion of order over chaos, of structure over dissolution, of being over non-being. This mythology, reflects psychological reality. Darkness does trigger increased anxiety in most humans, does activate the nervous system's threat response, does make the world feel less safe, less comprehensible, less under control. And this response is not irrational but is the inheritance of evolutionary history, of countless generations for whom darkness concealed genuine threats. Predators that hunted by night, rival groups that attacked in darkness, environmental dangers that could not be seen or anticipated when visibility was reduced. Modern urban humans, surrounded by artificial light, living in secured buildings, protected by law enforcement and emergency services, no longer face the dangers that shaped this response. And yet the ancient fear remains encoded in the nervous system, surfaces in children's fear of the dark, in the discomfort many adults feel in unlit spaces, in the way that horror and threat are consistently associated with darkness in literature, film, and art across all cultures. The Egyptians, in personifying darkness as a cosmic threat, in making the battle against Isfet a central religious concern, were giving cultural expression to this deep psychological pattern. And in doing so, they created a framework in which personal anxiety could be understood as participation in a universal drama, in which individual fear was validated as recognition of genuine danger, and in which the practices of religion became ways of contributing to the cosmic struggle, of supporting Mad against Isfet, of aligning oneself with order against chaos. This is not merely superstition, but is a sophisticated psychological technology, a way of taking diffuse existential anxiety and giving it form, narrative, and actionable response, transforming passive fear into active participation in something larger than the individual self. Cross-cultural mythology reveals that the association between darkness and chaos, between light and order, is nearly universal. In the Genesis creation account, the first act of God is to separate light from darkness, to create distinction where there was only undifferentiated void. In Zoroastrianism, the cosmic struggle is between Ahura Mazda, the Lord of light and truth, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of darkness and deception. In Norse mythology, Ragnarok brings the destruction of the ordered world, and this destruction is associated with the sun and moon being devoured, plunging everything into darkness. In Hindu cosmology, the Kali Yuga is the age of darkness and ignorance, furthest from divine light. In Christian tradition, hell is associated with outer darkness, while heaven is described as eternal light. These consistent patterns suggest that we are not dealing with arbitrary cultural constructions, but with fundamental features of human psychology, with the way that consciousness experiences itself as light, as awareness that illuminates and makes comprehensible, while unconsciousness, confusion, ignorance, and death are experienced as darkness, as that which obscures, conceals, and renders experience incomprehensible. The fear of darkness is ultimately fear of the unknown, fear of what cannot be seen or controlled, fear of the limits of consciousness itself. And in recognizing this, we can understand why the Egyptians placed such emphasis on light, on the sun, on the maintenance of visibility and order, because these were not just physical preferences, but were expressions of the deep need to maintain coherence, comprehensibility, and structure in the face of forces that constantly threaten to dissolve these achievements. Modern manifestations of this same anxiety appear in fears of societal collapse, of the breakdown of law and order, of descent into chaos, of systems failure, of the disintegration of shared meaning and common understanding. And these fears, while they may be triggered by specific political or social conditions, draw their emotional power from the same archetypal pattern that the Egyptians expressed through the mythology of Mad and Isfet, the recognition that order is fragile, that civilization is a thin layer over chaos, that the structures we depend upon require constant maintenance, and are always vulnerable to disruption. The psychological comfort that comes from routine, from predictability, from knowing what to expect and having established procedures for handling situations, reflects the deep need for order, for mad, and the anxiety that arises when routines are disrupted, when the unexpected occurs, when established patterns break down, is a taste of Isfet, a glimpse of what it feels like when the framework that makes sense of experience begins to dissolve. The Egyptians understood that order does not maintain itself, that mad requires active support, requires conscious choice, requires individuals to align their behavior with cosmic principle rather than with immediate self-interest. And in this understanding, there is wisdom that extends beyond religious belief. Because whether or not the cosmos itself cares about human behavior, human societies certainly require individuals to limit destructive impulses, to honor agreements, to maintain structures that benefit the collective, even when these structures limit personal freedom. Darkness as cosmic threat is a metaphor for everything that undermines social cohesion, ethical behavior, shared reality, and the possibility of meaningful communication and cooperation. And while we may no longer believe in literal demons that attack during the night, we can recognize the same pattern in misinformation, in propaganda, in the deliberate sowing of confusion and division, in cynicism that corrodes trust, in nihilism that denies the possibility of meaning, in despair that sees no point in maintaining effort or integrity. These are the modern manifestations of Isfet, the forces that work against order, against mad, against the fragile human achievements of justice, truth, compassion, and collective flourishing. And the Egyptian mythology, in making these forces visible, in personifying them as cosmic threats that must be actively resisted, provides a framework for understanding that passivity is not neutral, that the maintenance of good requires action, that order is always an achievement rather than a default condition. Tonight, as darkness surrounds you, as the external world fades from perception and you prepare to enter the internal darkness of sleep, you might recognize that this daily transition is a rehearsal of the larger patterns we have been exploring, that each descent into sleep is a small journey through Isfet, through the dissolution of waking order, through the realm where ordinary logic does not apply, and where consciousness encounters materials it has not consciously chosen. And yet this journey, which happens every night, which you have survived countless times before, carries no actual threat, is simply a natural process, a necessary balance to the order and structure of waking life. And perhaps in recognizing this, in allowing darkness to be not an enemy but simply another aspect of the cycle, not a threat but a teacher, not chaos but a different kind of order that the waking mind struggles to comprehend, you can begin to release the ancient fear, can allow yourself to rest in darkness without resistance, without the need to maintain vigilance, without the exhausting effort of holding back what cannot ultimately be held back. And in this release, there is not the collapse of order but the discovery of a deeper order, the recognition that consciousness and unconsciousness, light and darkness, mad and Isfet are not enemies but complementary aspects of a larger pattern, and that peace comes not from the victory of one over the oth, but from the ability to move between them with trust, with grace, with the understanding that both are necessary, both are true, and both are held within something larger than either. The gods in Egyptian mythology were not distant or indifferent beings occupying some remote celestial realm, unconcerned with the details of human existence, but were instead constant observers, witnesses to every action, every word, every thought, every secret deviation from mad. And this conception of divine surveillance, of being perpetually watched by powers that could judge, punish, or reward, reveals a profound psychological mechanism by which consciousness regulates its own behavior, internalizes social norms, and creates the experience of accountability even in the absence of external enforcement. And this mechanism, which appears across nearly all religious traditions in various forms, suggests something essential about how human morality functions, how conscience emerges, and how the self maintains coherence between public performance and private reality. The Eye of Horus, that ubiquitous symbol found on amulets, tomb walls, temple decorations, and funerary texts, represented not just vision but watchfulness, protection, and the capacity to see what is hidden, to perceive truth beneath appearance, to penetrate disguise and reveal reality. And when Egyptians wore this symbol or painted it on their possessions, they were invoking the presence of divine observation, reminding themselves that they lived under the gaze of forces greater than themselves. Forces that knew their true nature regardless of what face they presented to the world. The Eye of Ra, associated with the fierce solar deity, had similar connotations but carried more emphasis on judgment and punishment, on the dangerous power of vision that could burn and destroy as well as illuminate. And together these eyes represented the dual nature of divine observation, protective when one aligned with Mad, threatening when one deviated into Isfet, and always watching, recording, remembering what the human participant might prefer to forget. Why does the image of being watched produce such powerful psychological effects? Because human consciousness evolved in social contexts where reputation mattered, where being observed by other members of the group directly impacted survival and reproductive success, where cooperative behavior was enforced not just through punishment, but through the internalization of group norms, and the capacity to imagine how one appears to others, to model oneself as object of observation, became a fundamental feature of human cognition, creating what we now call self-consciousness. The experience of the self observing itself, evaluating itself from an imagined external perspective. Religious traditions took this social psychological mechanism and amplified it to cosmic proportions, suggesting that observation was not limited to other humans who happened to be present, but extended to supernatural beings who were always present, who could see not just actions but intentions, not just public behavior but private thoughts, not just what was done but what was considered and rejected. And this expansion of the observational field from the limited to the unlimited, from the occasional to the constant, from the physical to the metaphysical, created what might be called the divine panopticon, the sense of being under permanent surveillance by powers that could never be deceived, never be distracted, never fail to notice. The psychological impact of this belief is profound. Behavior that might occur in private, when no human witness is present, when there are no social consequences, is inhibited by the belief that divine witnesses are observing, judging, recording, and this internalized observation becomes conscience, becomes the voice that questions and evaluates even when no external authority is present, becomes the sense that some actions are wrong regardless of whether anyone else knows about them. And this sense, which we might call moral intuition or ethical sensibility, is partly the result of early socialization, partly the inheritance of evolutionary history, and partly the product of religious narratives that place the self under constant divine scrutiny. Cross-cultural examination reveals that the omniscient observer appears in multiple traditions. In Christianity, God knows every thought and sees every action, with nothing hidden from divine knowledge. In Islam, Allah is described as closer to the person than their jugular vein, knowing what the soul whispers to itself. In Hinduism and Buddhism, karma functions as an impersonal but inescapable recording system that tracks every deed and ensures eventual consequences. In traditional Chinese thought, heaven observes human behavior and responds with fortune or misfortune. In many indigenous traditions, Ancestors watch over the living and can intervene or judge based on how their descendants behave. These consistent patterns across unrelated cultures suggest that we are dealing not with historical transmission of ideas, but with independent discovery of the same psychological principle. The recognition that moral behavior requires accountability, that accountability requires observation, and that the most reliable form of observation is that which cannot be escaped, cannot be fooled, and operates continuously regardless of external circumstances. Modern psychology understands this mechanism through various frameworks. Freud's concept of the superego, the internalized parental authority that enforces moral standards and generates guilt when they are violated. Social psychology's research on moral licensing and moral cleansing, showing that people track their ethical behavior as though maintaining an account that must be balanced. Cognitive sciences work on theory of mind and perspective-taking, revealing how the capacity to imagine other viewpoints becomes the foundation for ethical reasoning. Neuroscience's identification of brain regions involved in moral judgment and the experience of being observed, showing that the sense of surveillance activates specific neural networks even when no actual observer is present. The divine observer is not a primitive superstition, but is a sophisticated cultural technology for maintaining social cooperation, for creating internal constraint on behavior that might otherwise be limited only by the risk of detection, for ensuring that individuals experience accountability as an internal reality rather than merely an external imposition. And while we might debate whether such observers actually exist in objective reality, their psychological reality is undeniable. Their impact on behavior is measurable, and their role in the development of conscience and moral sensibility is fundamental. The cost of living under constant divine surveillance is the burden of perpetual self-monitoring, the inability to truly relax into privacy, the sense that one must always maintain performance, always present the acceptable version of self, always guard against thoughts and impulses that might be judged unworthy. And this burden can become oppressive, can generate anxiety, shame, and the exhausting effort of maintaining constant vigilance over one's own inner life. The Egyptians, in their emphasis on divine observation, created a culture in which spontaneity and authentic impulse were dangerous, in which the natural human range of thoughts and desires became problematic, in which the self had to be carefully curated and controlled to avoid divine displeasure. And while this created a stable, orderly society with strong ethical norms, it also created individuals who could never fully escape the gaze, who carried within themselves the watchful eyes of the gods, who experienced privacy not as freedom, but as another arena of potential judgment. Modern secular cultures often struggle with the absence of this divine observer, with the vacuum left when religious belief fades and the sense of cosmic accountability dissolves. And the result can be ethical relativism, the feeling that morality is arbitrary convention rather than objective truth, the loss of internal constraint that religion provided. And yet there is also the possibility of developing ethical sensibility that does not depend on surveillance, that emerges not from fear of judgment but from genuine care for others, from recognition of interconnection, from the intrinsic value of compassion and integrity, rather than from hope for reward or fear of punishment. The question is whether human beings can maintain cooperative, ethical behavior without the belief in divine observation, whether conscience can function without the internalized voice of cosmic judgment, whether communities can sustain shared values without the enforcement mechanism of supernatural accountability. And the answer appears to be complex. Some individuals and some communities manage this transition successfully, developing secular ethics grounded in reason, empathy, and shared humanity, while others struggle, finding that without the scaffolding of religious belief, moral certainty dissolves and behavior becomes more self-interested, more opportunistic, more responsive to immediate consequences than to internalized principles. Tonight, as you release the day's concerns and prepare to enter sleep, you might notice the various observers that exist within your own consciousness, the voices that comment on your thoughts and actions, that evaluate and judge, that compare you to standards both internal and external, that create the experience of being witnessed even in solitude. And these voices are the descendants of the divine observers, are the psychological inheritance of thousands of years of religious culture. And whether you experience them as helpful guides or as harsh critics, whether they support your well-being or undermine it, they are not foreign impositions but are aspects of your own consciousness, parts of the self that have taken on observational function, and in recognizing them as such, as internal rather than external, as psychological rather than metaphysical, you gain the possibility of relationship with them, of dialogue, of negotiation, of gradually transforming harsh judgment into compassionate witness, of allowing observation to become not a source of shame, but a support for awareness. And in this transformation, the ancient pattern of divine surveillance can evolve into something gentler, something that serves consciousness rather than constraining it, something that helps rather than haunts. The myths we have explored, these 10 patterns of ancient Egyptian consciousness, are not isolated stories, not separate teachings that exist independently of one another, but are instead interwoven threads in a single tapestry of meaning, a comprehensive psychological system that addresses the fundamental anxieties of human existence. The fear of judgment and of being found unworthy, the terror that our own hearts might betray us with truths we cannot control, the recognition that we contain within ourselves animal natures that must be honored rather than denied, the anxiety that consciousness itself is fragile and requires protection from forces that seek its extinction, the dread of descent into realms where ordinary identity dissolves, the impulse to preserve the body as anchor for the self that fears fragmentation, the need to control death through ritual and preparation, the hope for continuation beyond mortality through eternal afterlife, the struggle to maintain order against the constant pressure of chaos and darkness, and the sense of living under observation by powers that see and remember everything. And together these themes create not just a religion but a map of the human psyche, a systematic exploration of what it means to be conscious, mortal, embodied, and accountable. Why do these myths endure? Why do they still resonate thousands of years after the civilization that created them has vanished, after the temples have crumbled, after the priesthoods have dissolved, after the rituals have ceased, and the gods are no longer actively worshipped? Because they encode patterns that are not culturally specific, but are instead fundamental features of human consciousness. Because they address questions and anxieties that have not disappeared with the advancement of technology or the evolution of social structures. Because the human relationship with death, with darkness, with moral uncertainty, with the struggle between order and chaos, remains essentially unchanged despite all the surface transformations of culture and knowledge. The myth as memory is a concept that appears in various forms across psychology, anthropology, and cultural studies. The recognition that stories carry information that transcends their literal content. That narrative is one of the primary ways that human consciousness organizes experience, creates meaning, and transmits understanding across generations. And that myths in particular serve as containers for psychological insights that are difficult to express in abstract or analytical language. Carl Jung developed the concept of the collective unconscious, the idea that beneath individual consciousness and personal memory, there exists a deeper layer of psyche that is shared across humanity, that contains archetypal patterns, fundamental images and narratives that appear spontaneously in dreams, in artistic creation, in religious vision, and in mythology across all cultures. And while the literal existence of such a collective unconscious remains debated, the phenomenological reality it describes is undeniable, that certain patterns do appear cross-culturally, that human beings separated by vast distances and with no historical contact produce remarkably similar myths, symbols, and narrative structures, and that these patterns seem to emerge from something deeper than individual experience or cultural transmission. The Egyptian myths we have explored appear in different forms across world mythology because they are addressing universal human experiences. Every culture must deal with death, must create frameworks for understanding mortality, must develop systems of moral accountability, must find ways to represent the struggle between consciousness and its dissolution, between order and chaos, between the known and the terrifying unknown. And while the specific deities, symbols, and narratives vary enormously, the underlying patterns remain consistent, suggesting that mythology is not arbitrary fantasy, but is instead a form of encoding, a way of preserving and transmitting psychological understanding through narrative forms that can survive across time and cultural change. The brain's relationship with symbolic narrative is profound. Neuroscience reveals that human consciousness does not primarily think in abstractions or logical propositions, but in images, stories, emotional associations, and embodied metaphors. That narrative structure appears to be fundamental to how memory is organized, how experience is integrated, how the self constructs continuity and meaning across time, and that stories activate neural networks in ways that abstract information does not, engaging emotional centers, motor cortex, sensory processing, creating a whole brain response that makes narrative particularly memorable, particularly impactful, particularly capable of shaping behavior and belief. The myths, then, are not primitive attempts at scientific explanation, not failures of rationality that should be replaced by better information, but are instead sophisticated technologies for encoding psychological and social wisdom in forms that the human brain can readily absorb, remember, and apply, forms that engage the whole person rather than just the analytical intellect, forms that can be transmitted orally across generations, surviving even when writing disappears or when formal institutions collapse. The Egyptian civilization itself eventually ended, conquered by foreign powers, its language forgotten, its religious practices abandoned, its knowledge seemingly lost to history. And yet the myths survived, preserved in monuments that could not be destroyed, in texts that remained even when they could not be read, waiting for later generations to rediscover them, to decode the hieroglyphic script, to reconstruct the meanings that had been embedded in stone and papyrus. And when that rediscovery occurred, when 19th and 20th century scholars finally gained access to the vast corpus of Egyptian religious texts, what they found was not alien or incomprehensible, but was immediately recognizable as dealing with the same questions, the same fears, the same hopes that continue to animate human consciousness. And this recognition across millennia suggests that the myths were successful in their fundamental purpose, which was not to describe literal supernatural facts, but to encode enduring psychological truth in forms that could transcend the culture that created them. Modern individuals, living in secular technological societies, often believe they have moved beyond myth, that scientific understanding has replaced the need for symbolic narrative, that rational analysis can address the questions that mythology once attempted to answer. And yet the myths persist, appearing not in temples and rituals but in dreams, in literature, in film, in the archetypal patterns that structure popular narratives, in the symbols that continue to evoke powerful emotional responses even when their original cultural context has been forgotten. And this persistence suggests that mythology addresses something that science does not. That symbolic narrative serves functions that cannot be fully replaced by empirical knowledge. That the human need for meaning, for connection to something larger than individual existence, for frameworks that make sense of suffering and mortality, remains active regardless of how much we learn about the physical mechanisms that underlie experience. The ancient Egyptians understood something that modernity often forgets: that consciousness is not just an information processor, not just a problem-solving mechanism, but is also a meaning-making entity, that we require not just accurate data about reality, but narratives that help us navigate the emotional and existential dimensions of being alive, being mortal, being responsible, being connected to others and to history, and that these narratives do not need to be literally true to be psychologically valuable, do not need to describe objective reality to serve important functions in maintaining mental health, social cohesion, and the sense that existence has purpose beyond mere survival. The myths encode survival information, but not the kind of survival information that tells us how to find food or avoid predators. Rather, they encode psychological survival information, patterns that help consciousness maintain coherence in the face of experiences that threaten to overwhelm it, frameworks that make suffering bearable by placing it within meaningful context, narratives that allow individuals to understand their personal struggles as participation in larger patterns that have been navigated successfully by countless others before them. And in this sense, the myths are maps, are guides, are the accumulated wisdom of a species that has been grappling with the same fundamental challenges for thousands of generations. Why does Egyptian mythology specifically continue to fascinate, continue to appear in contemporary culture, continue to be studied and reimagined and adapted? Perhaps because the Egyptians, in their intense focus on death, in their elaborate systems for managing mortality, in their refusal to accept that death meant absolute ending, expressed with unusual clarity and comprehensiveness the core human resistance to finitude, the insistence that consciousness is too valuable to simply vanish, that identity matters enough to warrant preservation, that the universe itself must be structured in ways that honor the significance of individual existence. And while we may not share their specific beliefs, while we may find their practices excessive or their anxieties neurotic, we recognize in their mythology our own struggles with the same questions, our own attempts to create meaning in the face of inevitable ending, our own need to believe Thoth. What we do matters, that how we live has consequences that extend beyond immediate circumstances, that we are part of something larger, older, more enduring than our individual lives. And in this recognition there is both comfort and challenge. Comfort in knowing that these struggles are not ours alone, that they are part of the human condition itself, and challenge in confronting how little has changed, how the essential questions remain unanswered, how each generation must still find its own way of living with mortality, with uncertainty, with the knowledge that consciousness is both infinitely precious and absolutely temporary, both the source of all meaning and a phenomenon that will end, leaving the universe exactly as indifferent as it was before we briefly emerged from, and then returned to unconsciousness. The shadows we carry, the ancient patterns that continue to move through modern consciousness, are not historical curiosities but living presences, active influences that shape behavior, emotion, and perception in ways we rarely recognize because they operate beneath the threshold of conscious awareness, in the realm where personal psychology merges with collective inheritance, where individual experience activates patterns that were established long before any particular person was born, and the Egyptian myths, in their enduring relevance, reveal how little the fundamental structure of human consciousness has changed despite the radical transformation of external circumstances. Despite the technological revolution that has altered nearly every aspect of material existence, despite the scientific knowledge that has supposedly replaced supernatural explanation with empirical understanding, the anxiety about judgment that drove the Egyptian obsession with the weighing of the heart appears in modern life in the constant self-monitoring that characterizes contemporary consciousness, in the way that people curate their identities for social media, presenting carefully edited versions of themselves for public consumption, while privately fearing that the real self, the unedited self, would be judged and found lacking. And this performance anxiety, this sense of living under observation, of being evaluated according to standards that are simultaneously internalized and external, creates the same psychological pressure that the ancient Egyptians experienced when they imagined their hearts being weighed in the hall of Mad. The fear that the truth of what one has been will be revealed and measured against an ideal that one has failed to achieve. The surveillance that once took the form of divine eyes now manifests as digital tracking, as algorithms that record every click, every search, every purchase, every movement through public and increasingly through private space, as cameras that observe, as databases that remember, as systems that analyze patterns and predict behavior. And while this surveillance is ostensibly for security, for convenience, for optimization of services and experiences, it creates a psychological environment eerily similar to the one the Egyptians inhabited, where nothing is truly private, where observation is constant, where the accumulated record of behavior exists somewhere beyond personal control and might at any moment be accessed, analyzed, and used for purposes one cannot anticipate or prevent. And the result is the same anxious self-consciousness, the same sense that one must always be performing, always aware of how one appears to the watchers, whether those watchers are gods or corporations or government agencies, or the distributed judgment of social networks. The impulse to preserve the body, to prevent decay, to maintain physical continuity across the boundary of death, appears in modern cryonics, in the freezing of bodies or brains with the hope that future technology will enable revival, in plastic surgery and anti-aging treatments that attempt to hold back biological time, in the photographic and video documentation that preserves images of how one appeared at various life stages, in the digital archives that maintain traces of existence. And underlying all these practices is the same anxiety that drove mummification, the fear that without physical preservation, identity will dissolve, that the self requires material substrate, that to be forgotten physically is to cease to exist in any meaningful sense. And while modern preservation techniques are more sophisticated than ancient Egyptian methods, while they are justified through scientific rather than religious frameworks, the psychological motivation is identical. The refusal to accept that embodied existence is temporary, that the physical form will eventually decay regardless of preservation efforts. That change is the fundamental condition of material existence and cannot finally be prevented. The need to control death, to manage it through elaborate preparation, to create detailed plans and procedures that provide the illusion of mastery over what cannot ultimately be mastered, appears in modern estate planning, in advanced medical directives, in funeral arrangements made years before death, in insurance policies and financial instruments designed to provide security for survivors, in the medicalization of dying that transforms a natural process into a managed procedure. And while these preparations are rational and often necessary, while they serve genuine practical purposes, They also reveal the same underlying anxiety that drove Egyptian funerary practices, the desperate hope that sufficient planning can eliminate uncertainty, that death can be made safe through proper procedure, that control can be maintained even across the boundary where control necessarily ends. The belief in eternal afterlife, though less universal in secular cultures than it was in religious ones, persists in modified forms. In the transhumanist vision of uploading consciousness to digital substrates, achieving immortality through technology rather than through spiritual transcendence. In the hope that scientific advancement will eventually solve mortality, will extend life indefinitely through genetic engineering or nanotechnology or other interventions not yet developed. In the legacy, projects through which people attempt to ensure that their influence, their ideas, their contributions will survive their physical death, maintaining a kind of immortality through impact rather than through continuation of consciousness. In the way parents speak of living on through their children, as though biological reproduction provides a form of persistence that transcends individual mortality. And all these contemporary manifestations reveal the same core resistance to finitude, the same refusal to accept that consciousness might simply end, that the self so carefully constructed over decades might dissolve without remainder, leaving nothing behind except gradually fading memories in the minds of survivors who will themselves eventually die. And this resistance, this hope for continuation in some form, is so fundamental to human psychology that it appears in culture after culture, era after era, surviving every rational challenge, persisting despite the complete lack of empirical evidence for any form of post-mortem consciousness. The fear of darkness, of chaos, of the dissolution of order, manifests in contemporary anxiety about social breakdown, about political instability, about the collapse of shared reality and common understanding, about the fragmentation of consensus that makes collective action and mutual trust possible. And when people speak of living in dark times, of forces of chaos threatening civilization, of the need to defend order against entropy, they are using the same symbolic language that the Egyptians used when they described the nightly battle between Ra and Apophis, the eternal struggle between Maat and Isfet, between structure and dissolution, between meaning and meaninglessness. And this language persists because the anxiety it expresses is not historically specific, but is instead a permanent feature of consciousness, which always experiences itself as fragile, as requiring maintenance, as threatened by forces larger than itself, and which projects this personal vulnerability onto cosmic scale, transforming psychological fragility into mythological drama. The animal gods, though no longer worshipped, persist in the psychological recognition that human consciousness is not separate from nature, but is continuous with it, that beneath the veneer of civilization lie ancient drives and instincts, that the rational self is not the whole self, that embodied existence means participating in patterns that long predate human culture. And this recognition appears in various forms of ecological consciousness, in rewilding movements both literal and metaphorical, in the therapeutic use of animal-assisted interventions, in the persistent fascination with shape-shifting and transformation narratives, in the way that people identify with animals as spirit guides or totems or symbols of aspects of self that remain unintegrated. And though the literal belief in gods with animal heads has disappeared, the psychological truth that these hybrid deities expressed remains valid, remains actively necessary for any complete understanding of what human beings are, which is not pure reason or transcendent spirit, but is instead an improbable union of ancient biological inheritance and recently evolved symbolic consciousness, of instinct and reflection, of nature and culture, of animal and something more or perhaps not more, but simply different, complexified, capable of self-awareness and abstract thought, but not thereby separated from the embodied, instinctual, sensory dimensions of existence. The heart that testifies, that carries truths the conscious mind would prefer to forget, appears in contemporary trauma research, in the understanding that the body keeps score, that emotional memory is stored in ways that bypass conscious awareness, that past experiences continue to influence present reactions regardless of whether they are consciously remembered, that the autonomic nervous system responds to triggers that the cognitive mind does not recognize, creating symptoms, anxieties, behavioral patterns that seem irrational until their historical origins are discovered and integrated. And this modern scientific understanding validates what the Egyptians expressed mythologically, that the heart knows what the mind denies, that truth is not only cognitive but is also somatic, embodied, held in tissues and nervous pathways, and that genuine self-knowledge requires listening to the body's testimony, attending to what the heart carries, allowing the unconscious to speak rather than silencing it through willpower or rationalization. The shadows we carry are not pathologies to be eliminated, but are instead aspects of the human condition, inheritance from thousands of generations who faced similar challenges, similar fears, similar questions, and the Egyptian myths. In giving form to these shadows, in naming them and creating rituals for working with them, offer not solutions but companionship, the recognition that these struggles are shared, are universal, are part of what it means to be human, and that there is dignity in facing them consciously rather than pretending they do not exist, wisdom in learning from how others have navigated these same territories, and comfort in knowing that consciousness, for all its fragility, for all its vulnerability to dissolution and darkness, has proven remarkably resilient, has survived countless descents into the underworld, countless journeys through night, countless confrontations with mortality and meaninglessness, and has always, so far, found ways to continue, to create meaning, to maintain the difficult balance between acceptance and resistance, between surrender and struggle, between acknowledging the shadows and not being consumed by them. The question of why humans create gods, why consciousness seems driven to populate the cosmos with supernatural beings, with personified forces, with entities that observe and judge and intervene in human affairs, is not a simple question of ignorance or wishful thinking, but touches something fundamental about the nature of awareness itself, about how the mind models reality, about the deep structure of human cognition that predisposes us towards certain forms of explanation, certain patterns of meaning-making, certain ways of organizing experience that feel natural, compelling, psychologically necessary, even when they are not empirically verifiable. The Egyptian pantheon, with its hundreds of deities, its complex relationships and mythological narratives, its elaborate hierarchies and spheres of influence, was not a crude attempt at scientific explanation, not a primitive failure to understand natural causation, but was instead a sophisticated system for organizing psychological and social reality, for giving form to forces that were genuinely experienced but could not be directly perceived, for creating a symbolic language through which the invisible dimensions of existence, the subjective, the emotional, the moral, the existential, could be discussed, explored, and integrated into a comprehensive worldview. Gods are not explanations for physical phenomena, but are personifications of psychological realities, and the genius of mythological thinking is precisely this personification, this transformation of abstract forces into beings with personality, motivation, relationship, narrative, because the human brain is fundamentally a social organ, evolved primarily to navigate complex social environments, to track relationships, to predict behavior, to understand intention and emotion. And consciousness naturally applies these social cognitive capacities to all aspects of experience, seeing agency where there may be only pattern, seeing intention where there may be only causation, seeing relationship where there may be only correlation. This tendency, which cognitive scientists call hyperactive agency detection, was evolutionarily advantageous because the cost of false positives, of seeing agency that is not there, was minimal compared to the cost of false negatives, of failing to detect a predator or a hostile human. And so consciousness evolved with a bias toward seeing minds, toward detecting intention, toward interpreting events as caused by agents rather than by impersonal forces. And this bias is the cognitive foundation upon which religious thinking builds, transforming the wind into a god, the sun into a deity, death into a personified power, not because ancient peoples were stupid, but because personification makes forces manageable, makes them comprehensible, makes them entities with which one can potentially negotiate, appease, honor, or resist. The need for moral structure in the cosmos, the deep psychological requirement that the universe care about how we behave, that justice be not merely a human convention but a fundamental feature of reality itself, drives the creation of gods who observe, who judge, who enforce ethical standards through reward and punishment. And the Egyptians, in their elaborate system of divine surveillance and afterlife judgment, were expressing this need with unusual clarity. We're creating a cosmology in which moral behavior mattered not just for social consequences, but for eternal destiny. And this elevation of ethics from practical necessity to cosmic principle serves crucial psychological functions. It validates the sense that right and wrong are objective rather than arbitrary. It provides motivation for ethical behavior that extends beyond fear of human punishment. It creates hope that injustices will ultimately be corrected even if they are not addressed during life. And it suggests that existence has purpose, that consciousness is not an accident, but is part of a meaningful order that transcends individual lives and temporary circumstances. The fear of randomness, the terror that existence might be fundamentally meaningless, that there is no grand design, no ultimate purpose, no cosmic narrative into which individual lives fit, is perhaps the most profound anxiety that consciousness faces, more disturbing in some ways than the fear of death itself. Because death is at least an event, a transition, something that happens, while meaninglessness is a void, an absence, a negation of the very possibility that anything matters. And against this void, human beings create meaning through narrative, through purpose, through connection to something larger. And religion, mythology, the creation of gods and cosmic orders, is one of the primary technologies by which meaning is generated, maintained, and transmitted across generations. The Egyptian cosmology was not just a collection of supernatural beliefs, but was an architecture of meaning, a comprehensive framework within which individual lives could be understood as significant, as participating in eternal patterns, as mattering not just to oneself and one's immediate community, but to the gods, to the cosmos, to the fundamental structure of reality. And this sense of significance, of cosmic importance, is not a delusion that should be dispelled by more accurate knowledge, but is a psychological necessity, because consciousness that cannot find meaning, that cannot connect personal experience to larger purpose, struggles to maintain motivation, falls into depression, experiences the kind of existential despair that makes continued existence feel burdensome rather than valuable. Religion and myth are ways of creating meaningful structure, of organizing experience according to patterns that feel significant, that connect individual moments to eternal truths, that transform the chaos of raw sensation into comprehensible narrative. And whether or not the specific content of these myths corresponds to objective reality is almost beside the point, because their function is not empirical but existential, not descriptive but prescriptive, not about what is but about what matters, and these are different categories of truth, different registers of meaning, and the error of both fundamentalist religion and reductive materialism is the failure to recognize this distinction, the insistence that myth must be either literally true or completely false, when its actual status is symbolic truth, psychological truth, existential truth. The kind of truth that cannot be verified through experiment but can only be validated through lived experience, through the way that holding a particular narrative framework affects behavior, emotion, relationship, and the capacity to endure suffering and maintain hope. The Egyptian mythology, understood as a psychological system rather than as attempted physics, reveals sophisticated understanding of consciousness, of the challenges that awareness faces, of the tensions between different aspects of self, of the need for integration of shadow material, of the importance of ritual in marking transitions and creating meaning, of the way that symbolic action can affect psychological state even when the symbols do not correspond to physical entities, and modern psychology, particularly depth psychology in the Jungian tradition, has recognized this wisdom, has learned to work with myth not as outdated belief that must be replaced, but as living symbolic language that can facilitate healing, integration, and the development of what Jung called individuation, the process by which the self becomes whole through conscious relationship with unconscious material. The gods, then, are not beings that exist independently in some supernatural realm, but are personifications of forces that exist within the psyche, are ways of giving form to aspects of consciousness that are genuinely present, genuinely influent, but are not easily accessible to direct rational analysis. And by externalizing these forces, by projecting them onto cosmic screens as deities with personalities and mythologies, consciousness creates the distance necessary to observe them, to understand them, to develop relationship with them, rather than being unconsciously driven by them. And this externalization is not primitive error, but is sophisticated psychological technology, and when properly understood, when the projection is recognized as projection rather than as objective reality, the relationship with these forces becomes more conscious, more nuanced, more capable of supporting growth and integration, rather than remaining at the level of literal belief or fearful superstition. The architecture of mind that the Egyptians mapped through their mythology remains relevant because the fundamental structure of human consciousness has not changed, because we still contain within us the judge and the judged, the light and the darkness, the order and the chaos, the observer and the observed, the mortal body and the seemingly immortal awareness, and we still struggle with integration, with acceptance, with the maintenance of meaning in the face of mortality, with the tension between the desire for control and the necessity of surrender. And the ancient myths, when approached as psychological rather than as supernatural, when read as maps of inner rather than outer territories, retain their power to illuminate, to guide, to provide frameworks for understanding experiences that remain difficult to articulate in purely rational language. Tonight, as you rest in the space between waking and sleeping, between the ordered consciousness of day and the fluid consciousness of dream, you might recognize that you are inhabiting the same psychological territories that the Egyptians mapped through their mythology, that the gods they named are aspects of your own awareness, that the battles they described are struggles that occur within rather than without, and that the wisdom they encoded in symbol and narrative is available not through belief, but through recognition, through the willingness to see in ancient images the reflection of present reality, through the understanding that mythology is not about the past, but about the eternal present of human consciousness, which contains within itself all the patterns, all the tensions, all the possibilities that have ever existed, waiting not to be believed but to be recognized, integrated, and allowed to support the difficult, magnificent work of being human, of maintaining awareness in a universe that seems indifferent, of creating meaning in the face of mortality, of choosing again and again to engage with existence despite knowing how it ends. And in this choosing there is heroism. There is participation in something that transcends individual life. There is the continuation of a pattern that stretches back through countless generations and forward into an unknowable future. And this participation, this connection to the human story, is perhaps what the gods always represented. Not supernatural beings, but the recognition that consciousness is not isolated, not alone, but is part of an unbroken chain of awareness that has been asking the same questions, facing the same fears, creating the same meanings since human beings first developed the capacity to wonder, to worship, to tell stories about why we are here and what it all means. Darkness, when approached not as enemy but as teacher, reveals dimensions of experience that the daylight world cannot access, offers knowledge that consciousness in its brightly lit, sharply focused, goal-oriented mode systematically excludes. And the wisdom traditions, including the Egyptian mythology we have been exploring, suggest that wholeness requires relationship with both light and darkness, that health is not the elimination of shadow but the integration of it, that the journey into the underworld is not deviation from the path, but is the path itself, the necessary descent that makes genuine transformation possible rather than mere superficial change. The underworld in psychological terms is not a place of punishment but a realm of encounter, where consciousness meets what it has rejected, what it has denied, what it has split off in order to maintain coherence. And this meeting, though it may be frightening, though it may feel like dissolution or death, is actually the condition of growth, because the self cannot become whole by excluding parts of itself, cannot achieve integration by maintaining rigid boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable aspects of experience, cannot mature without confronting the material that has been relegated to unconsciousness, because it threatened the stability of identity or contradicted the self-image that one has worked to construct. The Egyptian journey through the Duat, that nightly passage of the sun through territories of darkness, through regions populated by demons and obstacles, through gates that test and challenge, is not just a solar myth, but is a map of what happens in any genuine transformative process, in any deep therapeutic work, in any spiritual practice that moves beyond surface techniques and into actual encounter with the unconscious. And what this map reveals is that transformation is not comfortable, not safe, not easily controlled, but requires willingness to enter territories where the ordinary self cannot maintain its usual functioning, where defenses must be temporarily released, where vulnerability is not a weakness to be overcome, but is the very condition that allows change to occur. The value of confronting ancient fears, of turning toward rather than away from what has been avoided, lies not in the elimination of fear, but in the discovery that fear, when faced directly, when examined rather than fled from, often transforms, reveals itself to be less overwhelming than imagined, releases the energy that was required to maintain avoidance. And in this release there is increased capacity, increased range, increased ability to navigate complexity without collapsing into simplistic categories of good and bad, safe and dangerous, acceptable and forbidden. The Egyptians understood that darkness contained knowledge, that the night journey was necessary, that even the sun god himself had to descend, had to pass through the underworld, had to be temporarily diminished before he could emerge renewed. And this pattern, repeated nightly, suggests that renewal is not a one-time achievement but is a cyclical process, That consciousness requires regular descent into darkness, regular release of daylight control, regular surrender to processes that cannot be directed by will, and that this surrender is not failure but is wisdom, is recognition of the natural rhythm that governs all living systems, the oscillation between activity and rest, between expansion and contraction, between engagement and withdrawal. What the underworld teaches about the self is that identity is not fixed, not solid, not the unchanging essence that we often imagine it to be, but is instead fluid, contextual, capable of transformation, containing multiplicities and contradictions that the daylight self prefers not to acknowledge. And when consciousness descends into the underworld, when it encounters the aspects of self that do not fit the conscious narrative, the initial experience is often of fragmentation, of losing the coherent sense of who one is. But if the descent continues, if the encounter is sustained rather than fled from, what emerges on the other side is not the loss of identity but a more complex, more inclusive, more resilient sense of self that can hold paradox, can contain contradiction, can acknowledge that the one who acts with kindness and the one who harbors destructive impulses are not separate people, but are different aspects of the same consciousness. And that wholeness includes both, requires both, cannot exist through the denial of either. The mythology of death and rebirth, which appears in Egyptian religion through the story of Osiris, who is killed, dismembered, restored, and reborn as Lord of the underworld, through the nightly death and rebirth of the sun, through the initiation rituals that symbolically enacted death and resurrection, is not about literal biological death, but is about psychological death, the ending of old forms of identity, dissolution of outdated self-concepts, the release of attachments and identifications that have become restrictive rather than supportive. And this death, though it may be experienced as loss, as grief, as the painful ending of something familiar, is also the condition of rebirth, because new forms cannot emerge while old forms are rigidly maintained. New growth cannot occur in spaces that are already completely occupied. New possibilities cannot be explored, while one remains committed to preserving everything exactly as it has been. The integration of shadow and light is not a final achievement, not a state that is reached and then maintained effortlessly, but is instead an ongoing practice, a continuous choosing to remain in relationship with the full range of what one is rather than collapsing into identification with only the acceptable parts. And this practice requires courage, requires honesty, requires the willingness to see oneself clearly without immediately moving into judgment or defense, requires what might be called compassionate witnessing, the capacity to observe one's own thoughts, emotions, impulses, and behaviors with the same kind attention one might bring to observing another person one cares about, with curiosity rather than condemnation, with interest in understanding rather than immediate evaluation of good or bad. The darkness as teacher offers lessons that cannot be learned in daylight, shows aspects of reality that are invisible when consciousness is fully engaged in ordinary activity, reveals patterns that only become visible when the usual organizing structures are temporarily released, and cultures that have maintained relationship with darkness, that have honored night as sacred time, that have created rituals for engaging with the unconscious, tend to produce individuals who are more psychologically integrated, more comfortable with ambiguity, more capable of holding complexity, than cultures that treat darkness only as absence of light, that flood every space with artificial illumination, that attempt to maintain constant waking consciousness, constant productivity, constant control. The Egyptian reverence for the night journey, their understanding that even the sun must descend, that even the highest God must pass through darkness, suggests a wisdom that modern culture has largely forgotten, the recognition that consciousness requires rest, requires periodic dissolution, requires regular return to the formless, the unstructured, the chaotic creative potential from which new forms emerge, and that resistance to this natural rhythm, the attempt to maintain constant daylight consciousness. Constant control, constant productivity, is not sustainable, eventually produces burnout, exhaustion, the kind of collapse that the system was designed to avoid, but which becomes inevitable when natural rhythms are chronically violated. Tonight, as you complete this journey through Egyptian mythology, as you allow the narratives and images and psychological patterns to settle into whatever places they will occupy in your own consciousness, you might recognize that the journey is not truly ending, but is instead transforming. That what began as listening to or reading about ancient myths has become something else, has become a form of self-recognition, a seeing of your own patterns reflected in stories that are thousands of years old. And in this recognition, there is both comfort and challenge. Comfort in knowing that what you experience is not unique or isolated, but is part of patterns that have been navigated countless times before, and challenge in the invitation to engage with these patterns more consciously, more deliberately, more courageously than you may have done before. The darkness that surrounds you now as you rest, as your breathing slows and your body releases the tensions of the day, is not the enemy that the anxious mind sometimes imagines it to be, but is instead the natural complement to light, the necessary balance, the fertile void from which renewal emerges. And in allowing yourself to descend into this darkness without resistance, without the need to maintain control, without anxiety about whether you will emerge unchanged, you are participating in the same ancient pattern that the Egyptians honored through their mythology, the pattern of death and rebirth, of descent and return, of dissolution and reintegration. And this pattern is not something that happens to consciousness from outside, but is something that consciousness does, something that awareness enacts as part of its own natural rhythm, its own self-regulation, its own movement toward greater complexity, greater integration, greater capacity to hold the full range of what it means to be alive, to be mortal, to be embodied, to be aware in a universe that is simultaneously beautiful and terrifying, meaningful and indifferent, structured and chaotic. And the wisdom is not in choosing one side of these paradoxes over the other, but in learning to inhabit the tension between them, to move fluidly between light and darkness, between order and chaos, between control and surrender, between the known and the unknown. And in this fluid movement, this dance between opposites, there is something that might be called grace or wisdom, or simply the mature functioning of consciousness that has learned through experience, through descent, through encounter with the underworld, that wholeness includes everything, rejects nothing, and finds in even the darkest territories gifts that cannot be obtained in any other way. We return now to where we began, to the question of judgment, to the image of the heart being weighed against the feather of truth. But we return changed, having made our own journey through the territories that the myths describe, having encountered the animal gods that represent the instincts we contain, having faced the serpent that threatens consciousness each night, having descended into the underworld where identity dissolves and transforms, having witnessed the desperate attempts to preserve the body against decay, having seen the elaborate rituals designed to control what cannot finally be controlled, having contemplated the promise of eternity and the burden it carries, having felt the pressure of darkness against the fragile order we create, having recognized the eyes that watch from within and without, and having discovered perhaps that these myths are not about ancient Egypt, but about consciousness itself, about the eternal present of awareness that contains within it all the patterns, all the struggles, all the paradoxes that have always defined what it means to be human, to be mortal, to be awake in a universe that seems to sleep. The weighing of the heart, that central image of Egyptian spirituality, reveals itself now not as primitive superstition, but as profound psychological insight, as recognition that the self contains within itself its own judgment, carries within its own depths the record of how it has lived, what it has chosen, where it has aligned with truth, and where it has deviated into deception. And this record cannot be edited, cannot be hidden, cannot be escaped through cleverness or charm or social performance. Because it is written not in external books but in the very tissue of being, in the patterns of response that have been etched through repetition, in the emotional residues that accumulate from action, in the way that the self knows itself when all pretense is stripped away, and what remains is simply what has been, what was done, how one moved through the world. The feather, that impossible standard of lightness, suggests that truth has no weight, that integrity creates spaciousness rather than burden, that the heart that has lived honestly, that has not accumulated the heavy residue of unacknowledged harm, of chronic self-betrayal, of systematic violation of one's own values, is light not because it has done everything perfectly, but because it has remained in relationship with truth, has acknowledged error when it occurred, has made amends where possible, has carried consciousness rather than denial. And this lightness is not the absence of having lived, but is the presence of having lived consciously, of having allowed experience to pass through rather than accumulating as unprocessed weight. The journey through these 10 myths, through these 10 dimensions of Egyptian psychological understanding, has been a journey through the landscape of consciousness itself, through the territories that every human awareness must navigate regardless of culture or era. And the myths have served as guides, as maps that show not the literal geography of some supernatural realm, but the symbolic geography of inner space, the regions that consciousness encounters when it turns its attention inward, when it examines its own functioning, when it asks the questions that cannot be avoided by anyone who remains awake to the full implications of existence. We have seen that the gods are not separate beings, but are aspects of the self given form, given personality, given narrative, so that consciousness can develop relationship with forces that would otherwise remain unconscious, unexamined, operating from the shadows without awareness of their influence. And in naming these forces, in creating stories about them, in performing rituals that honor them, the Egyptians were engaging in what we might now call psychological integration. The process of bringing into conscious relationship the multiplicity of energies, drives, intelligences, and patterns that constitute the totality of what we are. We have seen that death, which appears to be the ending that the myths are trying to avoid or transcend, is actually the teacher that makes consciousness possible, that creates the urgency that transforms mere existence into meaningful life, that provides the boundary against which significance can be measured, and at the elaborate Egyptian attempts to control death, to map the afterlife, to preserve the body, to ensure continuation, are not failures to accept mortality, but are ways of engaging with it, of refusing to look away from it, of insisting that death matters enough to warrant the full attention of culture, art, religion, and psychological reflection. We have seen that darkness and light, order and chaos, mad and isfet, are not enemies that must fight until one defeats the other, but are complementary aspects of a larger pattern, that consciousness requires both, that health is found not in the triumph of light over darkness, but in the capacity to move between them, to descend into chaos and return to order, to release structure and rebuild it, to die and be reborn, not once but cyclically, regularly, as part of the natural rhythm that governs all living systems, and that consciousness ignores at its own peril. We have seen that the anxiety about being watched, about living under observation, about having one's hidden thoughts and secret actions known and judged, reflects the structure of self-consciousness itself, The way that awareness contains within itself both subject and object, both the one who experiences and the one who observes that experience, and that this internal division, this capacity to see oneself from outside, is both the source of moral consciousness and the origin of shame, both the foundation of ethical behavior and the cause of enormous psychological suffering when the observer becomes harsh, critical, unforgiving, turning the natural capacity for self-reflection into a weapon of self-attack. We have seen that the body matters. That embodiment is not a prison from which consciousness must escape, but is the very ground of experience, the vehicle through which awareness encounters world, the form that gives consciousness specificity, limitation, perspective, and that the Egyptian obsession with preserving the body reflects not primitive materialism, but sophisticated understanding that identity is inseparable from the particular flesh that has housed it. That memory is stored in tissue. That the self is not a ghost piloting a meat machine, but is an emergent property of embodied existence, and that to honor the body is to honor consciousness itself. The myths, in their enduring relevance, in their capacity to speak across millennia to concerns that remain vitally present, demonstrate that human consciousness, for all its cultural variation, for all its capacity for change and adaptation, retains fundamental structures, fundamental challenges, fundamental questions that do not disappear with technological advancement or social evolution, and that these structures, challenges, and questions deserve the kind of sustained attention that the Egyptians gave them, the willingness to create comprehensive symbolic systems, to develop elaborate rituals, to pour enormous resources into the exploration of what it means to be mortal, conscious, embodied, and accountable. Tonight, as this narrative comes to its close, as the words that have been guiding your attention begin to fade and release you into the wordless realm of sleep, you might recognize that you carry within yourself the entire Egyptian mythology, not as belief, but as structure, not as supernatural reality, but as psychological truth, that your consciousness contains the hall of Ma'at where judgment occurs, contains the animal gods that represent different aspects of nature and instinct, contains the solar bark that travels each night through the underworld, contains the preserved body that resists dissolution, contains the elaborate rituals that attempt to control the uncontrollable, contains the hope for eternity and the fear that consciousness might simply end, contains the struggle between order and chaos, contains the watchful eyes that observe and remember, and contains as well the possibility of integration, of wholeness, of a way of being that does not require the denial of any part of what you are, but instead finds room for everything, makes space for the full range of human experience, embraces both the heights and the depths, the light and the darkness, the heroic and the shameful, the beautiful and the terrible, because consciousness large enough to contain all of this, consciousness that does not fragment itself through rejection of what it finds unacceptable, consciousness that can witness itself with compassion rather than with harsh judgment, is consciousness that has learned what the myths were always trying to teach, which is that you are not separate from the cosmos you perceive, not isolated from the patterns that have been unfolding since awareness first emerged from the biological substrate that produced it, not alone in your struggles, or unique in your suffering, or singular in your search for meaning, but are instead part of an unbroken lineage of consciousness that stretches back through time, beyond measure and forwa, into futures you cannot imagine, and that this participation, this connection to something larger than individual existence, is perhaps what the Egyptians meant by eternal life, not the continuation of personal consciousness in some supernatural realm, but the recognition that consciousness itself continues, that awareness persists through the generations, that what you are is not only this particular body, this particular name, this particular lifespan, but is also the manifestation in this moment of a pattern that has been expressing itself through countless forms, that will continue expressing itself through countless forms to come, and that in recognizing this, in seeing yourself as both the individual wave and the ocean that produces all waves, there is a kind of peace, a release from the desperate need to preserve what was never meant to be permanent. An acceptance that allows you to engage fully with the life you have been given, while also releasing the grip that turns engagement into grasping, that transforms love into possession, that makes the precious temporary moments of consciousness into burdens that must be defended rather than gifts that can be received, experienced, and released when their time has passed. And in this release, this final letting go of the need to control, to preserve, to defend against the inevitable, there is not the darkness that the anxious mind fears, but is instead a deeper darkness, a fertile darkness, a darkness that is not empty but is full of potential, full of rest, full of the possibility of renewal. And as you descend into this darkness now, as consciousness releases its hold on the day and allows the nightly dissolution to occur, you are not falling into danger but are returning to source, are participating in the pattern that the myths have been describing all along, the pattern of descent and return, of death and rebirth, of the sun sinking into the western horizon with the promise, the trust, the ancient certainty that it will rise again, that consciousness will return, that awareness will reassert itself after its necessary rest, and that when it does, when you wake tomorrow into whatever circumstances await, you will bring with you something from this journey, some trace of the wisdom that the Egyptians encoded in their mythology, some recognition that the struggles you face are not yours alone, that the patterns you navigate have been navigated before, and that consciousness, for all its fragility, for all its vulnerability to dissolution and darkness, has proven itself again and again to be remarkably resilient, remarkably creative, remarkably capable of finding meaning even in the most difficult territories, and that this resilience, this creativity, this meaning-making capacity is not something you must create from nothing, but is something you inherit, something you participate in, something that carries you even as you imagine you are carrying it. And in recognizing this, in trusting this ancient pattern, you can rest now, can release the weight of trying to control everything, can allow the heart to be as light or as heavy as it actually is, knowing that the journey continues regardless, that consciousness persists regardless, that you are held within patterns larger and older and more enduring than any individual life, and that this holding is enough, has always been enough, will always be enough. And that sleep, like death, is not the ending that fear imagines, but is simply the natural completion of one cycle and the beginning of another, world without end. Consciousness eternal, not because any individual awareness continues forever, but because awareness itself continues, expressing itself through form after form after form. And you are one of those forms, this particular expression of the pattern, this unique manifestation of consciousness exploring what it means to be alive, to be aware, to be human, here, now in this moment that is already passing, already becoming memory, already joining the vast archive of experience that the heart carries, that the myths describe, that the universe holds in whatever way the universe holds anything. And the only task remaining is to let go, to release, to trust the pattern, to allow the descent, to make the journey that Ra makes every night, that every consciousness makes every night, through darkness into the possibility of dawn. And in this letting go, there is not loss, but is instead the deepest kind of homecoming, the return to what you have always been beneath all the names and forms and stories, the return to consciousness itself, vast and impersonal and yet somehow intimate, eternal and yet expressed through time. And as the words fade and the images dissolve and thought becomes dreamlike and dreamlike becomes sleep, know that you are not alone, have never been alone, will never be alone, because you are consciousness itself, experiencing itself, knowing itself, resting itself, and preparing always. preparing for the return, for the renewal, for the perpetual resurrection that is the daily miracle of waking, of opening eyes, of discovering once again that awareness persists, that you persist, that the pattern continues, and that this continuation, this simple fact of being alive and conscious for one more day, is the gift that no mythology can fully describe, that no wisdom can completely capture, that simply is and is enough and always has been, world without end.